am joined by Matt Whalan, who is a writer and oral historian, who's the person who suggested that we do this debate tonight, by our live show producer, Jordan, who lived in Israel for 14 years and has stuff to say about this, and by one of our favorite returning guests and one of the people who's in the debate that we're going to watch after our chat with him, Norman Finkelstein. How are you doing, guys?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm fine, thank you.
Can't complain.
Fair enough.
You can't complain. You're obviously not Jewish.
Am I? Maybe halachically not, but you know.
This is one of my favorite public intellectuals against one of my least favorite public intellectuals on my favorite podcast. So it's a great thing for me. Yeah.
Appreciate that. So Norm, you want to having impugned Jordan's Jewishness, you want to give us some background on this debate? This is happening in 2003 on Democracy Now!
Well, I'll try to be brief because obviously any topic you ask me, I can go on through eternity, but that would then preempt the actual debate. When I originally picked up the book, The Case for Israel, I didn't attach any significance to it. It just seemed to be pretty simple-minded and preaching to the choir. But I did notice something at the very beginning which kind of amused me. And what I noticed was that he was, because I know the book from time immemorial, like the back of my hand, that was published in 1984, and the book was a hoax, and I'm widely credited with having exposed that hoax. It was a major national bestseller, very influential for a period of time, and I basically took it apart and demonstrated that from many different angles, the book was complete nonsense. And when I picked up Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, I couldn't help but notice that at least in the initial chapters, large sections were simply lifted from that hoax from time immemorial. And that to me was kind of amusing. But beyond being amused by it, I didn't attach much importance to it. But then the book started to gain a lot of momentum, and it became influential. I think it was on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, or near the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it was being widely distributed on college campuses. The campus Hillels were buying it up in large numbers, and I think at the time, my memory is, I could be mistaken, they were being given away free. And so at that point, I realized that there is a political task to be completed, namely exposing this rather silly little book. And then I knew Amy Goodman, and I suggested to her that she do a program. She contacted Alan Dershowitz, and he agreed to be on the program, though I think he was hoping he would be debating either Professor Noam Chomsky or Professor Edward Said. And I was what you might call a very low third in that ranking. But it was me that he debated. And then he had a second problem, which is not to take away anything from Professor Chomsky, far be it for me to do so, or Professor Said, but I am very conscientious. I do my homework, and I do my homework again, which is to say I read the book once, I read the book twice, and I felt confident that I would be able to prevail in the court of public opinion in an exchange with him. Now, I'm going to just say two more things so as not to belabor my presence. Number one, many people said afterwards, what did you expect would happen? Namely, after the debate, he went after me with a vengeance. As Professor Chomsky put it, he went on a jihad to try to destroy me professionally. And a lot of people basically said, I got what was to be expected would be coming to me. And I would want to respond to that by saying, and I think I could say this with complete certitude, I'm not engaging now in some sort of exculpation or cover-up. I honestly believed that it was going to be a tit for tat at the scholarly level. I would level my claim, he would level his claim, it would go back and forth. I did not anticipate that it would degenerate into a jihad to destroy me professionally. So I don't think it's fair to hold it against me that somehow I am feigning innocence and I didn't know what I was getting into when I publicly claimed that large parts of the book were in various forms fraudulent. There was a second point I wanted to make. Maybe it'll come back to me in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty strange, like, to think that doing a debate where you question the originality of the book. I mean, that seems like the sort of thing that it's like, what I would expect to be coming as a result of that is maybe later he writes an article where he tries to clear his name and he's really vicious or something like that, right? That would be the sort of thing I would expect. I wouldn't expect. I mean, I think nobody really in the normal course of things, certainly on most issues, would expect that would lead to an attempt to destroy somebody's academic career.
Yes, I honestly did. Not that I'm in any way rueful about what I did, but a very close friend of mine in high school, she since passed away, she was featured in a documentary film on my life. Now, I never actually watched the film. It's called American Radical. For some reason, I just couldn't summon the inner wherewithal to watch it. But many people told me afterwards that this friend of mine from high school, she eventually moved to Israel and lived there for the past 30 years until she prematurely passed away. Her name is Maxine. And she says in the movie, in a kind of indignation, what did he expect to think would happen? What did he expect would happen? And actually, maybe I was naive, but I expected that we were going to have a real tit for tat, point counterpoint. It would be a vigorous exchange, but I was confident in the end I would prevail. So that's what I expected. And okay, so I think that's the background. There was one other point, but it'll come to me.
You're muted, I think.
Okay, well, what were you saying in any case?
Well, just as a side note, that documentary is quite moving, I thought. But yeah, I just had a question for Norm, if that's all right. I was wondering if you had published anything before this debate, if Dershowitz had any awareness going into it of what your findings were, or what you were. No. The last footnote, the date in the book, if you look at the endnotes in his book, The Case for Israel, the last date was, I think, June 13th or June 15th, 2003. We did the debate in September, which means at max 3 months elapsed from the point that the manuscript was submitted and we did the debate. Now that's important for a certain reason. The reason is some people claim, well, he forgot some things he had written in the book. That happens. Authors do forget. And that's true. I am perfectly willing to acknowledge that sometimes I'm surprised. Oh, I said that in the book, I forgot. But this was just a 3 month elapse
between when the book was submitted and when we met. So the excuse of the author having forgotten, I don't find very credible in this case. Now, I want to make another point. These are all minute points, but they actually add up in trying to understand what happened. Publishing has radically changed in the last 20 years. In particular, when you did a book back in 2003, you had first proofs, second proofs, third proofs, and then final proofs. A book went through, after you've already submitted your final manuscript, a book went through 4 stages: first, second, third, and final proofs. Why do I mention that? Because each time, in each stage, the manuscript manages to get botched up by the typesetter or somebody else. You have to read it again and again and again. It was a total, complete nightmare, especially because even today, the transition from, say, a Word document to typesetting is not smooth. And so all sorts of things get botched up. So now you have 2 considerations. Consideration number 1, at maximum, only 3 months had elapsed between the time he submitted the manuscript for publication and the actual publication of the book. And number 2, by the time you're done with the final proofs, you are dreaming about every page in the book. You've been driven completely mad by this book. You loathe it, you hate it, you want to toss it into the nearest bonfire. You are so sick of that book. So the idea that he, quote unquote, forgot so much that was in the book is not very credible. Yeah. Had he written it or read it? The other point I wanted to make was, after the debate was over, I had made many brash allegations. I had leveled many brash allegations, which obviously in the course of an hour or 2, you can only skim the surface in documenting. And I know, everybody knows the standard debater's trick. The standard debater's trick is to say, this book is replete with errors, as Mehdi Hassan said to Matt Taibbi, error after error after error. And then the standard debater's trick is to say, but for reasons of time, I can only illustrate it with 2 examples. In fact, 2 examples is all you have. But you make it sound as if, for reasons of time or reasons of space, I can only illustrate it with 2 examples. And I understood that bad faith technique. And so after I completed the debate, I felt I had a responsibility, if I am a serious scholar, to copiously, comprehensively, thoroughly document the claims, which, as I said, were rather brash in the program. And so I produced a rather large book entitled Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Now, there's an interesting footnote to that story. The book was scheduled to be published by University of California Press, which is a very respectable publishing house. And then Professor Dershowitz went to the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, because because it's University of California Press, he sits on the overseers for the press, and went to Schwarzenegger to try to get him to cancel publication of the book. Schwarzenegger refused. He said it was a matter of academic freedom. Whether he knew what that meant, only God knows, or his lawyers just told him. And then Professor Dershowitz threatened to sue the press. And there was a funny there was a long correspondence which I gained access to. So the charge of plagiarism was ultimately placed in the first appendix of the book, where I document the plagiarism. So Professor Dershowitz, or his lawyer, sent a letter to University of California Press, and he said in the letter, quote, "If you don't remove the appendix now, it's going to be a very painful operation later." It was just a kind of mafia-like statement. I mean, it was so breathtaking. If you don't remove the appendix now, it's going to be a very painful operation later. And I have to say, it threw my publishing house into a panic, and we reached an impasse. A crisis erupted because they wanted to eliminate the appendix. And I said no, because then he's going to go around declaring victory that even the University of California Press removed the appendix because they knew the charges of plagiarism were false. And they said to me, "Look, Norman, we are a small university press," which is true. Presses are small operations, relatively speaking. They said to me, "If Professor Dershowitz sues us," meaning University of California Press, sues us in New York, they said, "we don't even have the money to fly out our staff for a trial." And so they really feared that he would bankrupt them. That was a very serious issue for them. How it was finally resolved, I don't want to go through the fine details, but the point being that I not only leveled the accusations, and he was not, we can say, particularly impressive in his replies, but I then took the next step and I fully documented my claims. And rather than try to reply to them, he tried to suppress publication of the book. I would also add, I always fear I go on too long, and there are three other people here.
No.
I would also add about 10 years, more than 10 years, about 15 years later, I met him in a an Indian restaurant on the Upper East Side. And I had very...
That is some Norman Finkelstein meticulousness. Got to get... No, it was an Indian restaurant. All right. I like it.
I had very conflicted feelings about sitting with him at the table. And I'm going to tell you why. Maybe you won't be able to fully apprehend. When the whole issue of the appendix, the plagiarism charge, and everything else, when it arose, Professor Dershowitz started to go around saying that my late mother was a Nazi collaborator, a capo. Yeah. And he was kind of vague. Either she was a capo, a Nazi collaborator, or I believed she was. His wording was ambiguous there. Well, my mother was very protective of me. She was a Jewish mother, exponential Jewish mother, exponentially increased Jewish mother, very protective of me. However, there was one area where her personal integrity and dignity prevailed over her Jewish mother, doting. And that was when it came to anything having to do with her experience during World War II. Without going into the gory details, she was a witness at the last major trial of Nazi concentration camp guards for Majdanek concentration camp. There was a trial in Dusseldorf in 1979, and she had to confront the guards. And I, unfortunately, got in the middle of it, and it got very ugly. So I knew that she would lose all respect for me if, in the face of that accusation, that she had collaborated with the people who had exterminated her family, that if I didn't do anything in the face of that accusation that was now posted on Professor Dershowitz's Harvard Law School website, if I didn't react, I knew her regard for me would precipitously plummet. I think that's redundant, would precipitously fall or plummet. And so I was very conflicted about sitting down with him in a restaurant table, and I'm being very literal here, and not throttling him, because there was a part of me that felt it was a betrayal of my parents' martyrdom. But I did, and I'm not going to deny it, I did sit and talk to him. And at one point, I said to him, "Why did you say those things about my mother?" So he said to me, "Well, you wrote," he started, you wrote. I stopped him short. And I said, "Professor Dershowitz, don't go there. By the way, if you have any doubt about what I'm saying, I have the tape. It was taped, the conversation. So I'm retelling it, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to give it up." I said to him, "Professor Dershowitz, don't go there." I said to him, "I know your background, and I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge it's impressive. You grew up in Borough Park, a very modest, lower middle class Jewish neighborhood. I was born in the same neighborhood. We were born within 8 blocks of each other. You then went to Brooklyn College, a good but modest college. And then you went to Yale Law School, and you graduate #1 in your class." I said, "I have no doubt that's an impressive achievement. I recognize that. Just as I recognize Chuck Schumer. He went to my high school. His father was an exterminator. He came from a very modest background, and through sheer brilliance, also being a complete crook, but the brilliance was there. No question about it. He was valedictorian in my high school, and so forth." And I said, I acknowledge. I said, "Now look, Professor Dershowitz, I read everything you've written in the last 40 years, and it's obviously worthless." It was interesting, his reaction. You know how he reacted? He just shrugged his shoulders like that, like, "Yeah, what can I do about it?" He didn't deny it. I said, "But you're clearly literate, sufficiently literate to know I never wrote anything like that. You know that was a complete lie." And you know how he responded? He said, "After what you did to me on Democracy Now!, what did you expect me to do?" In other words, he knew what he was saying was a lie, but it was tit for tat. You besmirched my name, I'll besmirch your name. It was an interesting. No, I don't find him a particularly interesting personality. I find him rather dull. He's a combination of two Jewish archetypes. The Jewish Talmudist, because what is a Talmudist? A Talmudist is commenting on the commentary of the commentary of the commentary of the commentary. The whole Talmud is about twisting words. It is. It's about how to manipulate words to lend them meanings which are very hard to discern by the naked eye. And that's what a lawyer does. You hire a lawyer to prove black is white, night is day, cold is hot, etc. Tall is short. That's what a lawyer does. A lawyer is paid to prove that the text does not say what it clearly says. That's a lawyer's job. So he's a combination of the Talmudist, the commentary and the commentary and the commentary and the commentary, trying to prove this sentence does not really mean what this sentence seems to mean. This word does not seem to mean. And the other Jewish archetype, the shyster. He's a combination Talmudist and shyster. And that's what a lawyer is. That's what a lawyer is. A lawyer is a combination of those two Jewish archetypes. And that's why so many Jews are lawyers. It's absolutely true. No, it is. It's a very striking fact if you go on the subway nowadays. There's only one group of people who still read books. One group of people. Only one. Orthodox Jews. They're sitting there reading the Talmud. No, it's deeply impressive. It's deeply impressive. The discipline, no cell phone, no iPhone, and the commitment. It's our religion, and they sit and read. And that was, we used to Jews called it a yeshiva. Yeshiva is the Jewish school, Jewish day school. A yeshiva bocher, B-O-C-H-E-R, a Jewish reader. And that's Dershowitz. But he's not an interesting personality. No, he's not. I don't want to, not everybody has to be an interesting personality, but he just happens not to be. I still found that conversation insightful, even as I had with him in the Indian restaurant, even as I have to acknowledge my mother would probably have loathed me. Maybe even to the point of disowning me, no, but losing a lot of respect for me. And you know what? I think she would be right. I let my vanity get the better of my principle.
Is that you said that was recorded? Is that public?
I don't know if it was ever made public, but I have it. Yeah, there was a Lebanese fellow who invited me. I couldn't afford an Indian restaurant on the Upper East Side. I couldn't even afford to eat the leftovers thrown out in the garbage bin. But he invited me, and he quietly recorded it.
Wow.
At least you had the opportunity to confront him.
Yeah, but you know what? It's totally meaningless to him. Notions like honor, integrity, respect for the dead. Look, he's a lawyer, a high-priced lawyer. He takes all the dirtiest cases.
Well,
literally, his name is the image that's conjured up when I think of a devil's advocate. Yeah. And a man who's claimed that he isn't litigious. Okay, you're a defense attorney, but he's made a number of defamation suits.
I have to say that's one of his funniest lines.
It's hilarious.
Yeah, he's suing everybody.
And someone who also is a self-avowed defender of the First Amendment, who comes after your right to
Well, that's what I was thinking, because I'm old enough that I can remember a time when I had, vaguely positive feelings about Alan Dershowitz, because this is before all of this. This is before he started talking about torture warrants and things like that during the War on Terror. Because back, in I don't know, I mean, like in the 90s when I was a teenager, I remember, a lot of his branding was that he was a big civil libertarian, that's why he would take these 20 cases,
It was totally false. You're absolutely correct. That was his branding, but it was totally false. He projected himself as a civil libertarian crusader. But if you actually look at his cases, if you take his book, The Best Defense, which was his first major work, the first case in the book was two members of the Jewish Defense League, which was a far right-wing Jewish organization. Now that doesn't mean anything because the whole country, lunatic right, alt-right. But at the time, the Jewish Defense League was a far right Jewish organization. Without going into all the details, at that time there was a very famous, what was called impresario named Sal Urich. And Sal Urich was involved in cultural exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States. And at that particular moment, the whole Free Soviet Jewry movement had arisen. And so Urich was seen as a traitor to Jews because he was calling for cultural exchange when organized Jewish life was calling for a boycott of Israel and sanctions, not Israel, of the Soviet Union to free Soviet Jews, let them go, essentially let them leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel, because these organizations didn't want them to come here. They want the Jews to go to Israel. In any event, what's his first case? The JDL, these two members of the JDL, they planted the bomb in Sal Urich's office. He wasn't there at the time. They killed his secretary. And Dershowitz boasts that he got these two guys off. That's the first chapter of his best-known book at the time, The Best Defense. He boasts about the fact that he got two Jewish fanatics off after they killed a totally innocent secretary in Sal Urich's office. Then, what are his other cases in the book? This is not me, I'm just quoting the book. He was, you remember the Queen of Mean? You remember Helmsley? I forgot her first name. Melissa Helmsley? What was it? What was Helmsley's wife's first name?
Leona?
What?
Leona?
Yeah, Leona Helmsley.
That's
She was known as the Queen of Mean. She abused all of her staff and so forth. And then she was involved in some law case, maybe taxes, I don't remember. He got her off. That was another big case for him. Then there was this guy, Rabbi Bergman, Bernard Bergman. He was under investigation for abusing senior citizens in senior citizen homes. Actually, that was the big case that got Geraldo Rivera on the map. He revealed the abuse of the senior citizens in Bernard Bergman's nursing homes. Dershowitz got him off. Then you have the whole slew. He did a lot of the pornography cases. He was the lawyer for I Am Curious Yellow. That was the first porn film to be imported in the U.S. from France. I Am Curious Yellow. He then did Deep Throat. He was the lawyer for Deep Throat. Then he was the lawyer for Harry Reams when Linda Lovelace accused Harry Reams of having abused her on set during the making of Deep Throat. So he did a lot of the pornography cases. He then did, of course, the O.J. Simpson case. He did the
Mike Tyson.
The Mike Tyson case, the Klaus Van Bülow case, and Van Bülow almost certainly murdered his wife.
Yes.
Tyson, we could disagree on this, but I just find it, look, I don't want to get into an argument here, but if somebody goes up to Mike Tyson's apartment at 4 a.m., what do you think is going to happen? You're going to be reading the Talmud? Very unlikely. But he got accused of having raped her. I see you're giving me a skeptical look. Fine, I'm not woke, so I say these things. But Mike Tyson, Klaus Van Bülow, O.J. Simpson, wife murderers, wife batterers. Can you tell me what that has to do with civil liberties? If you actually read his books, which I've read, he did a couple of capital punishment cases. Did that woman disappear on me?
Well, the Sheldon Siegel case.
Back. I think there's having a connection issue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
If she disagrees with me, she should disagree and tell me.
That's
not. And tell me to shut up. That's okay. I don't mind.
Trust me, that's not it.
So he
Sorry,
did.
I cut out there. That wasn't in protest.
He did the. He didn't do any. So he did a couple of capital punishment cases, and he claims he gave like 10 minutes of his time for Angela Davis. Who knows? I don't even know. That's it. There was no civil liberties. He got the civil liberties reputation because he defended pornography. And at that point in time, pornography was technically a civil liberties issue because it was defended in the Supreme Court on the grounds of the First Amendment. I thought the grounds were completely stupid. It's called the Stanley case, Stanley. But that's when the Supreme Court, ruled pornography to be legal. So the pornography got conflated with civil liberties in that era. But otherwise, he had nothing to do with civil liberties. Almost all of his cases had to do with some sort of abuse of women, up to and including murdering them.
And he didn't have much care for the civil liberties of prostitutes, who he thought should be taken to court and not their Johns. There's a lot of information about everything that you're saying now in an article, I think from 2019 in the New Yorker. It's really interesting.
I was by Connie Brook. I had been in touch with her when she was writing. She interviewed the main party who was suing Dershowitz at the time with the whole Epstein affair.
Exactly, sure.
And she said to me she found the witness credible. I didn't know what to make of it. As you know, that case was finally decided out of court. There was a out-of-court settlement. Nobody knows what happened. But, knowing Dershowitz, Dershowitz is a criminal lawyer, and criminal lawyers, what do? They hire detectives to dig up dirt on the other side. And her lawyer was a guy named David Boies, Boies, Boies. And Boies is as big a crook as Dershowitz. So you can imagine each is digging up dirt on the other side, and then they finally decide to settle out of court. What to me is the most interesting is, okay, I will credit you, Ben Burgis, and I noticed that on your website you have Ben/Burgis, which leads me to believe that those are your pronouns, and I find that, dare I say, very peculiar. But okay, so for now.
Matt, do you have a question for Norman?
I wanted to say that, Ben, you can be excused on the grounds of youth, but in the case of Harvard, when he finally left, now they claim he retired. I don't believe that. I think that Harvard knew what was coming down the pike with the whole Epstein stuff, and they told him to leave.
I was going to say that because he had Dershowitz's demeanor leading up to Epstein's, let's say for the sake of argument, suicide was sort of defensive in a sweaty and strange way, I think it would be fair to say. He made a big point of saying that, he'd never, because he'd had a massage.
But he kept his underwear on.
Oh, yes.
Let it be known.
Yes, right. Also, I'll note in the
let it not be known. I want to sleep tonight. I want to have nice dreams.
I think you're gonna have nightmares after we rewatch this. Frankly,
in the late '90s, he also editorialized in favor of lowering the age of consent, which you can conclude from that what you want, but yeah, I have, and I will tell Andy, who designed that graphic, that he was suggesting that my given and surnames are my pronouns. But Matt,
I was going to say, when he finally left Harvard, they had 3 consecutive days of the who's who of academia singing his praises, with Martha Minow, the great feminist legal scholar, leading the orchestra, praising him. And the pretense is, what's his name? Oh God. What's the guy who, Jeffrey? Oh, this is ridiculous. The guy who was caught pleasuring himself during a video in the New Yorker, a video conference in the New Yorker, Jeffrey.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. Yeah, I don't remember his name, but I remember that.
Oh yeah, Jeffrey. He just came out with a book. Tubin.
oh.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. He was caught tubining.
Which is close to gooning, but just
that's true.
less time.
Right. Well, tubining is reserved for the sophisticated, the woke crowd. In any event, so Tubin writes this article when Dershowitz starts defending Trump. What happened to Alan Dershowitz? As if he had been an exemplary civil libertarian who suddenly underwent this metamorphosis and turned into a monster. He was always a monster. I mean, the stuff he wrote on Israel-Palestine, he was defending by denying that Israel was engaging in massive torture of Palestinian detainees. There was no question about that. And in the book Beyond Chutzpah, I go through the cases where he was constantly called as a witness by Israel or its defenders in order to prove that Israel's record on these sorts of things was exemplary. But they make it out as if he did this sudden volte-face and he had become evil. No, he was always evil. You knew he was evil. You didn't care. Stop with these fake pretenses of a sudden about face with Professor Dershowitz. Just look at his cases. Look at who he defended, and you'll get a very clear picture of the person. And I'm very
plausible deniability at that point for your own defense. I should have known.
again?
I think that's more about the plausible deniability of whoever is making the claim that he became evil.
Yeah. Can I just add too? I just want to jump in for a second. On this point, Dershowitz also got his start opposing the Vietnam War, or at least he was critical of it, to my knowledge. And he also is self-identifies as a civil liberties lawyer, and he really takes every opportunity to slip that into the conversation. Especially, I mean, it doesn't happen as much in the debate with you, but I've noticed in other public appearances or debates, particularly where the audience might be liberal or in the center, he often makes sure to include that he he was opposed to the Vietnam War and he's a civil liberties.
When was he
I
opposed?
think he does that. I think he does that because he wants the audience to like stop and think about the license that affords him to argue for whatever horrendous atrocity that he's about to defend. He also, in the years after this, maybe 10 years later, when the Snowden leaks came out, he went around the country basically defending the security and surveillance apparatus, and he leaned heavily on his title as a civil liberties lawyer to do that. And he then, after that, was the few years where he went around doing a TV talk show tour, basically auditioning to be Trump's lawyer. And the Epstein stuff happened. And
my own view was, now I can't prove it, I thought he was defending Trump because he thought he might be convicted on the Epstein stuff, and he wanted Trump to get him out. He would get the get out of jail free card if he defended. I thought that was his motive. Otherwise, it was very unclear why he would have defended Trump.
But basically, just to piggyback on your point, I think one of the reasons that prompted me to recommend this debate to Ben is because I think I was watching some talk show host I like, a podcaster, I don't remember, wouldn't say their name anyways, but they said something like they had played a clip of Dershowitz saying something really crazy, and they said something like, "What happened to this guy?"
Nothing happened to the guy.
And for decades before and decades since this, decades before and decades after this debate, he's been a pretty disgusting person the whole time. And one other thing I just want to say real quick is this goes way back to something you said earlier about, you were talking about what he'd said about your mother, and he said other pretty disgusting things about you too. And he also incited, there was I think a Jewish organization that had posted flyers in your building calling on your landlord to evict you. Is that accurate?
I don't think he had anything to do with that.
No, not that he had anything to do with that. But I just wanted to make the point that people often use charges of anti-Semitism to to silence arguments against Israel or criticisms of Israel. And some of the very main people who do that have, in my opinion, said pretty gross anti-Semitic things about you. And so I just wanted to note that. That was from way earlier in the conversation.
I believe he lumped you in with Holocaust denial as well.
Yeah, he said he wouldn't debate me because I'm a Holocaust.
He also called Bernie Sanders a self-hating Jew. So.
He's called Norm that too. He called Norm that.
Yeah. It's also that would be I think whatever other flaws Norm has, I think he grew up in a household where it would be very difficult to be a Holocaust denier.
That's been my defense all along. I say, given my family background, if I were a Holocaust denier, I would have to be certifiably insane.
Entirely.
Now, you've heard me talk, or you've read what I've written. Does it sound to you like I'm certifiably insane? Because that's the only possible conclusion you can draw from the fact that I'm a Holocaust denier, given my family background. It's just, it's so wild. Now, my friends growing up, they might rightfully accuse me of being a Holocaust affirmer, just to say I didn't shut up about it. It was my family, or what was left of my family. But Holocaust denier was sort of wild.
Yeah.
You can't write a book about the instrumentalization of the Holocaust and deny it at the same time.
Good point.
Thank you.
I think you're a prime candidate for law school.
Oh no! Watch out for your coming for you.
You hear what you just said? You can't write a book deploring the instrumentalization of a Holocaust and say it never happened.
Insane. By the way, he absolutely did do something along the lines of the, I don't know, Vietnam War antagonism. I had never heard of that before, but in the beginning of the debate that we're hopefully going to watch soon, he likes to come out and say that he was against the Israeli land grabs in 1967 on, I think he said,
So what did he do? Did he
very apocryphal.
write an article about it? Did he go on TV to say it was bad? Did he?
No, who knows?
Thought about it. Yeah.
He says,
were these just thoughts in his
Hold
head?
it in his heart.
he says that he helped write UN Resolution 242.
Yeah.
With Lord Carrington.
I'm glad that
Everything out of his mouth. You know, they used to say about Richard Nixon, how do you know when Richard Nixon is lying? Answer, whenever he moves his lips.
Exactly. I think he also called you a propagandist, but he also says in the interview that he cites in his book, some pamphlets from APAC. So.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's actually when he's being accused of plagiarizing a quote from Joan Peters.
No, I took it from somewhere else.
No, look, the same quote is in the APAC.
Exactly.
Also, I mean, I don't want to get into it too much before it happens, but
the same Jewish office in Israel wrote the pamphlet and wrote the book.
yeah, my two sources are Joan Peters and APAC. Yeah.
there you go.
Amazing.
All right.
Well, I hope you enjoy. I haven't watched it in many years, but I have to say, some of the lines still make me laugh.
High rewatch value.
I just watched it today. Yeah.
My favorite line is the book you claim to have read. What do you mean claim? What do you mean claim? And I knew, trouble ahead. I better be able to get out of this before I have a new lawsuit, and I have a lot of lawsuits. He said,
You should have blamed it on Natalie Portman. Come on.
Natalie Portman, and I'm going to end it there because you have to watch the debate and I have to do my homework. Natalie Portman is an interesting story.
What homework are you doing, Norm?
I'm writing stuff on affirmative action.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So, as you know, one of the people thanked in the acknowledgments of the case for Israel, Dershowitz's quote-unquote book, one of the persons is Natalie Portman, but with her maiden name.
Hirschlag,
yes. And there's an interesting story there which I've always wondered about.
Yeah.
Now, Natalie Portman, or Hirschlag, was a very smart young woman. She attended Harvard. She got her degree in French literature. And I always wondered, as you know or may know, she herself did an about face on Israel because she was one of the researchers for the case for Israel. She was a fanatic. And within a short period of time, she became hypercritical of Israel to the point that she was awarded Israel's highest award, the Israel Prize. She turned it down. And I've always wondered whether that drama that unfolded between myself and Professor Dershowitz, and then the subsequent publication of my book, when I went through the case for Israel line by line by line, literally. I went through it sentence by sentence by sentence and showed it was a fraud. I always wondered whether that particular episode, since she was one of a handful of research assistants, whether that episode was in any way influential in causing her to do an about face. To the very embarrassing.
She is smart, then probably.
Yeah, because that's what I felt. She's smart. She probably was curious. What is in this book? And then discovers, holy Toledo, he lied about everything.
Yeah.
So
She might have written it, though.
what?
She might have written it, so we don't know what that is.
Or copied it. My personal favorite line from the entire interview is when you said that you'd read The Case for Israel twice, and then you corrected yourself and said, actually, I've read it 6 times because I've read Joan Peters' books 4 times. Amazing.
Of course, there was a little hyperbole there. I did read Joan Peters' book 4 times. I read it many more than 4 times, by the way. But I said it was only the first chapters which were plagiarized. But, for the sake of a joke, you're allowed to exaggerate a little. Okay? So for the sake of the joke.
We'll forgive it. All right. Norm, go do your homework. I really appreciate you. Really appreciate you sharing this much of your time with us. This was fantastic.
I'm a little confused by one thing. I was confused about Ben Burgis with the slash because I've never heard those pronouns. I thought I was pretty up on pronouns. But I have never met a Jew named Jordan, especially a woman.
That's interesting. In Israel, actually, Yarden is a very popular name specifically for women. But I made a joke to Ben earlier, and I really regret not coming on and doing my Fran Drescher voice, so there would be no confusion. Like, hello, Dr. Norman Finkelstein. And then you would have just taken. But my grandparents are from your neighborhood as well, first generation Americans via Russia and Ukraine. So
really?
Yes. And I lived in Israel for 14 years. I haven't even been back in America for 1 yet, almost. So
really? Oh,
but no, the nose gets me by.
You have an interesting trajectory. Yeah, I live in what they call around here Little Odessa by the sea. So I speak to the Ukrainians every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's been an interesting transformation. At the beginning of the war, a lot of flags, a lot of people in cars with the flags honking their horns. Now, you'll see in the whole of Little Odessa by the sea, we counted it yesterday, there were just 2 lonely flags. And then a Sunday night, everybody's on the boardwalk, they're dancing, they're making music, but it was very noticeable to me, no one was collecting money for Ukraine.
That's interesting.
Even though the neighborhood now is about 80% Ukrainian, especially draft age Ukrainians who came over in the last year.
Well, the Jewish side of my family came over from Ukraine, and before I knew that Russia was actually going to invade, when it seemed like it might be, it might not actually happen. The joke I often told that I now feel a little bit bad about, given all the bloodshed in the last year, is my main position on the situation in the Ukraine is that if they wanted me to leave out the definite article, they should have been nicer to my family. But in any case,
leave out the definite article. What?
If they wanted me to leave out the definite article, they should have been nicer to my family. In any case,
that's a very subtle joke. That's way too sophisticated for your usual audience.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, guys.
I didn't even know the definite article was dropped until people started to correct me. I didn't even know it. Okay, so nice to meet all of you. Now get your popcorn, because I'm told that this video, the only one that's more popular than it on Saturday nights, is the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
That sounds right.
So this is a very special occasion for you. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Oh,
amazing.
Sorry, I just need to catch my breath for a second. Oh God, this is the weirdest intro to. Oh, I see you skipped over the beginning too. There's this kind of snappy jazz background while you're going through the footage of a destroyed Gaza.
Another thing is Amy Goodman keeps playing Frank Lowe during every break, and
Yeah.
now that she's playing Frank Lowe, like she's super excited about it.
It's super weird. The beginning is really interesting though. Just like two words on that, because this, I believe, is in 2003.
Yeah.
So a lot of the conversation at the beginning is about Bush and Iraq and the capture of journalists and killing of young people, the United Nations, and it just like, I think it's really interesting framing, because, you know, when terror is your foe, any sort of use is justified, right? And validated after the fact.
Yeah.
And that kind of puts us into the right mind space for getting into the debate on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, you know, when on September 11th, 2001, I was, you know, coming back to my dorm late at night, and I was passing by the TV on the dorm, and there was a rabbi, I want to say it was one of the Kushners, but I could be wrong about that, who was on TV, and he was talking about, you know, what had happened that morning, and he said, we're all Israelis now, and I walked by, I was like, oh fuck. That's such a grim prognosis, you know. About
anytime there were any sort of you know, attacks, terror, stochastic terror, anything, you know, Islamic in Europe, when I was living in Israel, there was always this like, aha, well now they'll see what it's like. Maybe now they'll understand. It's just disgusting.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in this too, and I think even to people who might be like pro-Israel today, it just does not age well for Dershowitz for that reason. Like he uses this gold in my ear quote. I mean, we'll see it. So, but you know,
yeah,
it was popular to use that quote then, and it's people do that less often now. But I just wanted to quickly say too, that there are like two moments where it's like easy to miss what's said, and in general, like if you feel like you miss something or need clarification, a lot happens really fast, and at certain points they start talking over each other.
Oh yeah,
I've watched it so many times. I can definitely help with that.
Amazing. Perfect.
And yeah, one of the things I was thinking was kind of funny, the other one's kind of important, so but we'll get to it.
JB says, "Is Jordan done a GTAA debate? Does she know how long these go? Lol." I think she knows what she's getting. All right.
I know. Actually, the timing is kind of perfect because this will be about 45 minutes long. So,
yeah.
I mean, that we're not going to stop and talk, but
I mean, it's amazing. It's actually like about 2 hours.
Yeah, because I mean, count to part two. This is, yeah. I mean, I think we are in for a long haul. So, because of that, we should get started. So, so let's do that. I have just
Out of Nowhere by saxophonist Frank Lowe with drummer Philip Wilson. Frank Lowe died Friday at the age of 60 in New York. You are listening to Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A 15-year-old unarmed Palestinian boy was killed and 14 Palestinians wounded when Palestinian militants and Israeli forces clashed in the southern Gaza Strip today. 20 Israeli tanks and bulldozers entered the Rafah refugee camp shortly after midnight, after 5 mortar shells were fired at a block of Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. No injuries or damage was reported. Meanwhile, Israeli Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom is scheduled to meet U.S. National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice and Secretary of State General Colin Powell today to discuss the U.S. position on the route of the so-called security fence in the West Bank. Prior to the meetings, Shalom said during an interview on the fence that Israel should, quote, do everything to defend as many West Bank settlers as possible, and said the purpose of the fence is to defend Israeli citizens. Meanwhile, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz is reporting the Israeli government spends at least $560 million a year on subsidies, infrastructure, and education for 220,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank and Gaza. The figure does not include military spending in those areas. Haaretz says Israel has spent at least $10.1 billion on the settlement since capturing the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. Successive Israeli governments have refused to disclose how much they spend on settlements. Haaretz says it compiled the figure after 3 months of research, including interviews with dozens of government officials and experts. And yesterday, President Bush told the 58th session of the United Nations General Assembly, quote, "The Palestinian cause is betrayed by leaders who cling to power by feeding old hatreds and destroying the good work of others." This comes days after the UN voted 133-4 to condemn Israel's decision to, quote, remove Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. The United States, Israel, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia voted against the measure.
It's always Micronesia.
Well, today we're going to have a very interesting debate on a new book called The Case for Israel. It's by Alan Dershowitz, who is one of the nation's foremost appellate lawyers, Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. His articles are published in the New York Times and other publications. His books include Chutzpah, The Vanishing American Jew, Why Terrorism Works, Shouting Fire, and America Declares Independence. We're also joined by Professor Norman Finkelstein. He is author of 4 books, including The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering. His writings have appeared in prestigious journals like the London Review of Books, the Index on Censorship, the Journal of Palestine Studies, the New Left Review, the Christian Science Monitor, and others. He is also author of Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. His latest book is called The Holocaust Industry. Today, a debate. We're going to begin with Professor Alan Dershowitz. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much for having me.
And why don't we start with you laying out the thesis of your latest book, The Case for Israel?
Well, I wanted to write a progressive liberal case for the two-state solution, and the two-state solution, which I think that most Israelis favor and have favored for a long time. I dedicate the book to Professor Aaron Barak, who is the president of the Israeli Supreme Court, and for a reason, because I argue in the book that no country in history faced with comparable threats, both external and internal, has ever tried so hard to comply with the rule of law. I compare Israel favorably to the United States in this regard. Its courts intervene actively in support of Palestinian rights, even during fighting in wartime. During the Jenin events, the Israeli court enjoined the Israeli military from engaging in certain actions which, in its view, violated the rule of law. The Israeli Supreme Court has banned the kind of rough interrogation techniques that are now being employed by the United States in Guantanamo. Israel is the only country in modern history that has never deliberately and explicitly retaliated against those who attack its civilian targets. For example, during the Six-Day War and the 1973 war and the 1948 war, its own residential areas were bombed by Egypt, by Syria, by Jordan. 1,600 shells lobbed into West Jerusalem. Israel never bombed Amman or Damascus or Cairo. They have, of course, bombed areas of Beirut and in the process have killed innocent civilians. But there's an enormous difference between doing, for example, what the United States and England did in the Second World War, bombing Dresden or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is deliberately targeting civilians and going after the way the United States did in Iraq, of which I am very critical, but nonetheless what the United States did, going after military targets, knowing that they're going to kill civilians in the process. And so myself, I oppose the settlements. I've always opposed the settlements. Since 1967, I've opposed the occupation. I think Israel made, in my view, a terrible mistake in 67. What it should have done is it should have made border adjustments pursuant to UN Resolution 242, which I actually consulted with Justice Goldberg. He was the ambassador to the UN and was involved in the process of that 242 resolution, which presupposed some territorial adjustments. The problem is Israel should never have occupied people, land is different from people.
What does that even
And
mean?
today, I think unilaterally, what it ought to do eventually, if it can't find a peace partner, is to make some unilateral changes, small ones, end the settlement.
Yeah, so obviously we don't want to stop for very long now because we've just barely started, but it is incredible that Dershowitz, like how Dershowitz is framing himself here. He wanted to make a liberal progressive case for a two-state solution, which makes you wonder
that
whether
most Israelis agree on. A two-state solution that most Israelis agree on.
Yeah, now one wonders why he didn't call both the case for the two-state solution.
Yeah,
Case for Israel. And then, yes, we have this claim that he was always opposed to the settlements. Now, when, where, and how he expressed this, or whether this is just in his heart, as we said, is unclear. And then, yeah, as Jordan points out, occupying land is different from occupying people.
I'm gonna make a T-shirt that says "Occupy land, not people," and just see what reactions I get on the street.
He tries to make this argument that because he does not consider Israelis colonialists, they are not occupying land, which is, I mean, at the very least, the distinction is not that important.
Yeah, if there is real
he gets to his definition of colonialism here in a little bit, and also doesn't stick to it, like within the same sentence. It's insane.
Yeah.
Well, I will at least say that "Occupy land, not people," as confusing as that would be as a T-shirt slogan, is still better than the T-shirt I was thinking about earlier, which is just like the obvious joke about the stuff earlier would be, I never took off my underwear T-shirt.
I don't like massages. Yeah.
Raising a lot of questions already answered by my T-shirt. But yes, let's keep going.
Settlements. In fact, my peace proposal is that Israel would have a schedule for ending settlements. That is a schedule for saying on so-and-so day the settlement ends, conditioned on best efforts by the Palestinians to end terrorism. That would create an incentive to ending terrorist acts. By the way, you never condition anything on the end of terrorism because that gives the terrorists a veto. What you condition it is on making good faith efforts. And if we can get Israel to end the settlements and the occupation and the Palestinian leadership to stop using terrorism as a tactic, I think finally something that could have happened in 1917, a two-state solution. In 1937, the Appeal Commission recommended a non-contiguous Jewish homeland, and the Israelis accepted it, and the Arabs rejected it. In 1947, when the UN allocated that portion of Palestine that had a majority of Jews in it to a Jewish state, and the portion of Palestine that had a Palestinian majority in it to an Arab state, we could have had a two-state solution. We could have had a two-state solution in 2002.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I think it's always good to flag the use of that like collective entity, the Arabs.
Right, yeah.
It's like who is the Arabs exactly, right? It's like in this sentence that, is made this decision and thus must live with it. But in any case.
Wait, did we lose Jordan though?
No, she's right there. She's on screen.
I thought she was frozen.
Oh, is she? She might be. I just thought she was being very still. Presumably that's a connection issue and she'll be back, but let's keep going.
All right.
2001, when Barack and President Clinton offered, to be sure, a non-contiguous state on 90-something% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza, with a capital in Jerusalem, with a $35 billion refugee package. And when Arafat responded by violence, instead of coming back to the table and saying, well, maybe we'll negotiate for a little bit more. So the two-state solution is inevitable. It's going to happen. The only question is how long it takes to happen. And my hope is that we can have a reasonable, serious debate about the future, about the rights and wrongs. I think there are rights and wrongs on both sides. But I'm nervous because I heard from my debating partner in the beginning what sounded like it was going to be simply an ad hominem attack on me as whether I'm qualified to teach at Harvard. I would hope we could elevate the discussion and keep it on the merits. I won't attack Mr.
I just, it's too much of a corporate brand proposition to let it go. That's saying something mean is not what ad hominem means, but whatever.
Well, yeah, I want to get into when the plagiarism the first one comes up. I'd really like to get into like the fact that Dershowitz keeps calling that accusation plagiarism.
Mr. Finkelstein on his merits of his position. Let people read his book and judge for themselves. And if he would refrain from personal attacks on me and let people judge the book on its merits, I think we can move the ball forward and have a reasonable, serious debate. I think it'd be interesting to know where we agree, where we disagree, what facts we share in common, what facts we have different views on, and whether they're empirical and could be subjected to reasonable resolution, where we have moral disagreements. I really think that in the end, today you read the news about Israel, there's other good news. There's in the works, according to the New York Times, a prisoner exchange between Hezbollah and Israel, in which Israel would get back one person, a civilian who was captured by Hezbollah in exchange for Israel giving back 400 or so prisoners. There's movement forward. Let's not destroy that movement forward by getting involved in meaningless ad hominem discussion. Let's see if we can elevate the debate and see if we can really move forward to the two-state solution that I think virtually everybody in the world today wants.
Professor Alan Dershowitz, author of The Case for Israel. Norman Finkelstein, your response.
Well, I appreciate Alan Dershowitz's seriousness, at least in these remarks. I have no intention whatsoever of getting involved in an ad hominem debate with Mr. Dershowitz. I'm interested in the facts. I was asked to come in and discuss his new book. I went home, purchased one copy. In fact, I purchased 2 copies. I read the book very carefully. I did what someone serious does with a book. I read the text. I went through the footnotes. I went through it very carefully. And there's only one conclusion one can reach, having read the book. And this is a scholarly judgment. It's not an ad hominem attack. Mr. Dershowitz has concocted a fraud. In fact, Mr. Dershowitz has concocted a fraud which, amazingly, in large parts, he plagiarized from another fraud. I found that pretty shocking. I found it shocking coming from a Harvard professor. I find it shocking coming from any professor.
Now we have to cut off at one point. I just want to warn everybody here that although I'm not a litigious person, when you make allegations of plagiarism, when you make allegations of plagiarism, that's a technical term
I agree.
Which has great legal implications.
I agree.
And, I can't obviously sit quietly by and,
you shouldn't.
Accept an allegation.
Let's look at the evidence.
Of plagiarism.
All right, let's look at the evidence.
Who is the plagiarism from?
Let's look at the evidence. In the first 2 chapters of your book, you extensively reproduce all of Joan Peters' pages in her book. I read it carefully. In 1984,
show me
I'm
one
going
sentence.
to show you.
Show me one sentence.
I am going to show you.
Okay.
I think I made available the charts to you.
No, I've no. You've shown me nothing. Let's start with that. That's a categorical lie.
Alan,
what you're hearing now on radio is that a claim that Mr. Finkelstein.
So what happened right there? This is one of the things that I wanted to point out that's easy to miss. Finkelstein turns to Amy Goodman and says, "I made these charts available to you." And Dershowitz pretends that Finkelstein was talking to him, so that he can accuse him of lying. Basically, that's my take on that.
I love that. Also, you see that Finkelstein has a number of books in front of him, and Alan seems to have just like endless pages of talking points. It's amazing.
It's funny how much is going on
that of Charlie Kirk's binder.
Yeah, it's exactly like that. Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. There's a lot going on in the room.
And get used to this level of interruption by Dershowitz. It doesn't stop.
Oh yeah, I think around this point is where Dershowitz starts to realize like what he just walked into.
He is fucked.
And like he takes the tact of like I'm just gonna run out the clock and change the subject as much as I can every time.
Which is great because eventually Amy Goodman's like, you know what, we're gonna give this a little bit more time.
Yeah, like, and then it lasts 2 hours. Like, what kind of friends does this guy have that nobody told him, like, dude, this is not going well?
And if he thought that he was gonna speak with Chomsky, I don't know what exactly he hoped for anyway. But.
Yeah, right. He did debate Chomsky, and that I don't think that went well for him either. But it wasn't quite as like embarrassing. Just
Well, I don't, I love like, if my worldview encompassed saints, Chomsky would definitely be one of them. But he's, Chomsky, I think, would probably not have quite Dershowitz's killer instinct as far as the way he's going about this right now.
Yeah.
I think there's just a very different personality style
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But
The saints have to die to be canonized too, and I'm pretty sure that Father Time is not going to kick it anytime soon.
Yeah.
Mr. Chomsky.
Also, and I want to just when it comes up, if we could talk about how Dershowitz keeps calling the plagiarism accusation ad hominem.
Oh yeah,
I think
and he also says he's not here for a debate. It's like, pretty sure that's what you're.
I mean, it was introduced as a debate.
Yeah, right.
You didn't object at the time,
I came here to pitch my book and talk over someone.
Right.
Fair enough.
Made available to me certain charts.
No,
that
I
is
gotta
a
say to
categorical
you,
lie.
no.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Dershowitz, I think you had about 5 minutes time. I wasn't looking at the clock. If we're going to have a civil debate, you're going to have to
But
remain.
it's not going to be a
You're
debate
going to
about
have
me.
to.
Let me
you're going,
be very
I'm
clear
not
about
debating
that.
you. I have
Okay.
no interest in you, Mr. Dershowitz. None at all. I'm interested in the scholarship, and I'm interested in the facts,
So
and I'm
am I.
interested in your book. Now, in 1984, one Joan Peters published a book called From Time Immemorial. The book was universally recognized by serious scholars to be a fraud. Without wanting to toot my own horn, I'm widely recognized as the person who exposed the fraud. I know that book inside out. I read it at least 4 times, and I went through all 1,854 footnotes. I started to read your book, Mr. Dershowitz. I then came to chapter 1, footnotes 10, footnote 11, footnote 12, footnote 13, footnote 14, footnote 15, footnote 16. All of the quotes are from Joan Peters. They are so from Joan Peters that you have a long quote here from Mark Twain on pages 23 to 24. I turn to Joan Peters, page 159 to 60. The identical quote from Twain with the ellipses in the ellipses.
Is the Twain quote wrong?
With the ellipses,
Is the Twain
let me
quote
finish,
wrong?
sir.
No, but the key
with
is
the
Yeah,
ellipses
but
in the
whatever.
same places. The identical quote from Twain with the ellipses in the same places.
It's been widely quoted, as you know.
Really,
Now-
Mr. Dershowitz.
No, what's your point? Is
we
it
then
is it
have
a correct quote?
Let me
Is-
finish,
No,
Mr.
no,
Dershowitz.
I want to ask
We
you a
then
question.
have
Is it a direct? Is it an
I'm-
accurate
okay.
quote of Twain? Did Twain say what
Professor
I
Dershowitz,
quote him
Stupid
as
the way
saying?
we-
dictionary
the way we
tactic.
can have-
Let me finish.
The way we can have a civilized
You have a
discussion
quote-
here is that
Mhm.
each person will get a chance
You
to
have
make their point
nearly
and
a-
won't be cut off. So
You have nearly a full-page quote from one William Young,
Mhm.
a British consul from May 1839.
Is it an
On
accurate quote?
page 8, I'm going to finish, sir.
Mhm.
On page 18 of your book, I turn to Joan Peters, page 184, the identical quote with the ellipses. I'm holding it up for the camera. Perhaps they can see. This is the length of the quote. The
Is it an
ellipses-
accurate
The
quote?
ellipses in the identical place. Last point. I'm not going to go through chapter 2 where there are 29 plagiarisms from Joan Peters.
Wait.
All
Let's be
caref-
very clear. It is
all
not
carefully-
plagiarism to
Yeah.
quote Mark Twain
Yeah,
correctly.
Yeah, except
That's not
that you
plagiarism.
cite Mark Twain and not Joan Peters. I'm a professor, sir. I know what plagiarism is.
And plagiarism
Sir,
is. Well, let's hear your
He's
definition
acting
of
like he
No, we're
doesn't
not
get
gonna
that.
get involved
No, we're
in
not
that
going to
now.
get. So you're using a word, and
I'm
you're not going
giving
to
you-
tell us what you
I'm
mean
going to
by
give the
it.
documentation, and you know what? We'll let everybody else decide for themselves because
Okay.
the documentation. One last example, and I want to make it very clear. In Joan Peters' book, From Time Immemorial, she coins a phrase. The phrase is turn speak. And she said,
No, she borrows it from.
No,
She borrows
sir,
it from
This is
who is
Sir,
it?
I'm
No,
sorry.
she attributes it and borrows it from
Sir,
somebody else.
I'm
It's not her own
sorry.
phrase.
She coins the phrase. You see, you don't know what you're talking about.
Mhm.
And that's
It's
pretty
not her
terrible. She coined the phrase turn speak, and she says she's using it as a play off of George Orwell,
Mhm.
which, as all listeners know, used the phrase newspeak.
Right.
And she coined her own phrase, turn speak. You go to Mr. Dershowitz's book, he got so confused in his massive borrowings from Joan Peters that on 2 occasions, I'll cite them for those who have a copy of the book, on page 57 and on page 153, he uses the phrase, quote, George Orwell's turn speak.
Mm-hmm.
Turn speak is not Orwell, Mr. Dershowitz. You're the Felix Frankfurter Chair at Harvard.
Yes.
You must know that Orwell would never use such a clunky phrase as turn speak.
I like it. I think it's a very elegant phrase.
Maybe you like it,
I
and
do.
evidently Joan Peters liked it, but George Orwell never heard of it, to the best of my knowledge.
We have to break for
Let me be
stations.
very
Just one
clear
sec.
about
Just
the
one sec. We
relationship
have to
between
wait.
the
Just
Peters book,
just
right?
one sec.
Fine.
We have to break for stations to identify themselves. There's 60 seconds, and when we come back, Professor Dershowitz can respond.
Thank
We're
you.
talking to Professor Alan Dershowitz. He's author of a new book. It's called The Case for Israel, in debate with Norman Finkelstein. Among his books, The Holocaust Industry and Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. You're listening to Democracy Now! Stay with us.
Let's pause for a second, can we?
Yeah.
Look at the charts.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Dershowitz is claiming that it's only plagiarism if the quote you incorrectly cited was made up.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, we're skipping over. I love that, Norm said about Ben's joke earlier that it's so sophisticated. It's probably going over the listeners' heads, but he doesn't stop for a moment himself here to explain what he means about the ellipses, which is basically that, Dershowitz in his book is omitting part of a quote the exact same way that Peters was. And I keep thinking of Joan Rivers.
Also that he cites Mark Twain and not the place where he found the quote.
Exactly. It's like what you do when you're an undergrad and you need to beef up your bibliography a little bit.
Yeah. I've seen students, and Ben, I mean, I don't know if you teach as well, but Ben, like, you've probably had students make this mistake by accident. I've been in class with students who they found a quote, they used the quote, and they attributed it to the person who said it, not knowing that you're supposed to attribute it, freshman or senior in high school, something. And professor,
pages 124 to 125.
Right. But the professor will.
If an intro student does that, it's forgivable. They don't know any better. Right? They don't know that they're not supposed to do that. If you're the Felix Frankfurter,
right. I can't imagine.
You should know that that's academic dishonesty.
Imagine if my buddy who did that as a freshman in college, and the professor pointed it out, and he was like, "Actually, I feel like that's a really ad hominem attack." On me and my work.
But is the quote correct, sir? Yeah, exactly. They'll get to the content of the Mark Twain quote, and is the content of the quote correct? No, I think it's bullshit, and we can get into why later, but that doesn't matter anyway. It's just hilarious. Then he's like, "Oh, you didn't like that one? Got another one for you." George Orwell, that forgettable character in literary history. Oh,
you
would never write something so clunky. Dershowitz, I like it. I thought that was so.
Yes, George Orwell.
Yeah. Oh man.
I know he's well out of his league already.
No, I mean the fact that Dershowitz, I guess, it's certainly he made it sound like he thought that Turnspeak was Orwell. In his initial response, and then it's that I mean clearly either, let's say for the sake of argument, Dershowitz or maybe one of his research assistants or somebody found that in Peters and was incredibly sloppy about it, or there was something in between what the research assistant said and what he got out of it that it got telephone gamed into this is what George Orwell said. And
I think we can safely assume that Natalie Portman just pretended to read 1984 in high school. Herschlag, excuse me. Someone in the comments earlier was like, wait, her name is Herschlag Portman? No, Herschlag was the former surname. I'm sorry. That is awesome though.
Also, I think it's really interesting that Dershowitz chooses the tact of, I mean, he's basically just acting like he doesn't know what plagiarism is. But like, Norm did a good job convincing me he was genuinely unprepared. But he is a lawyer and a professor. Like, he must know some of these things, you know. I don't know.
I mean, that's the thing, because like in a way, I mean, even beyond the academic dishonesty, it's also how could you just like, as a reasonably well-read person, how could you not know that the Orwell one was newspeak?
Yeah.
But he couldn't even remember his name. I mean, which
Yeah,
true.
But still, like of all of the authors, that one seems a little bit silly.
Yeah. And then the Mark Twain thing, like, I mean, that quote was chosen in the Joan Peters book because it supports these claims that she was largely trying to make about demographics, which is the key area of the book that Finkelstein found to be fraudulent. She made up demographic numbers, essentially, is my understanding. So that quote by Twain, you know, who was not a historian, by the way, to my knowledge.
No, he was just traveling, and not extensively even. It's like they took him to a field and he said, there's no Palestinians here.
Yeah, Twain was a tourist. And he was in the quote. I mean, so I should say, to back up just a little bit for anybody who's watching this not familiar with the larger context, like Peters' point, which Peters was using this Mark Twain quote to bolster, and Dershowitz is plagiarizing, for the case for Israel, is trying to support this like classical, like old timey Zionist thing. That's like, it was a land without a people for a people without a land. Yeah. And Mark Twain, who again is coming as a tourist, he's like his agenda as like a satirist and a sort of critic of religion, etc., is to sort of like put some cold water on like romanticization of the land. And he's like, look, this is like nothing. They're like a few Arabs and whatever. Exactly. That's like the tone of it. It's not a scholarly anything, right? It's and it's being used for like, because I could see how somebody could watch this and just not get what the context is. Right. That's right. The fundamental claim is, oh, it's cool, nobody was here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But he could be easily have been taken to an area that hadn't been developed yet, or a place that was inhabited by like nomadic. You know what I mean? Like
that's what happened. Yeah.
Exactly. And he sees some marsh or some desert and goes, all right, well, this is just kind of open area, but we have census statistics from the early Ottoman Empire that explicitly tell you how many people were living in what areas. There are portions of Israel which are Palestinian Arabic that have been inhabited since like 4000 BCE, Acre, Ramle, Jaffa. So just really stupid, often cited Zionist claims which are completely falsifiable.
Yeah. Also, anybody who's, read some Mark Twain, which you might have done along with the Orwell, knows that like exaggerating for effect is kind of central to the kind of writing that Mark Twain did.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And he has like a pretty famous anti-war poem, which is just as a side note.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of Twain's, a lot of Twain's other views, Dershowitz wouldn't like so much, but let's keep going.
He did. He liked them since the Vietnam War, actually.
Yeah, since whatever it was. Look, this is not any sort of, Norm would have a lot of contempt for this research method, but like while we were talking about this earlier, I quickly opened up Dershowitz's, Wikipedia page and did a search for the word Vietnam, and anything that he did to oppose the Vietnam War wasn't significant enough to make it onto the Wikipedia page. Wow. So that might have also just been in his heart, his opposition to the Vietnam War.
He talks about it. He says it at the beginning of the Chomsky debate that like they agreed in their opposition to the Vietnam War. Like,
yeah, is this like was Dershowitz's opposition to the Vietnam War that like he was on the phone with his mom and he was like, yeah, no, this seems pretty bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, let's listen to some jazz. I think they're going to a break.
Yeah, Frank Lowe.
It's such a weird combo. It's so fucked up.
Like, break.
I hate it.
They're both so pissed off.
It's a really strange choice. This is like a sadder jazz, at least. It's a little more solemn than the original one.
Yeah.
More music from the late Frank Lowe here on Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report, as we continue our debate on Alan Dershowitz's new book. It's called The Case for Israel. Alan Dershowitz is professor of law at Harvard Law School, in discussion with Norman Finkelstein, who teaches at DePaul University in Chicago. His books, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict and the Holocaust Industry. Professor Dershowitz, your response to this very serious charge, if I do.
Well, it's a frivolous charge, of course. What happened was this. Of course, I read the Peters book. Anybody writing a book on the Middle East would. I also read a book called The Myths and Facts, which is a book put out originally by APAC and then published separately and independently, and probably 30 or 40 other books which use the same quotes. They're very extensively used quotes by Mark Twain, because Mark Twain traveled to Palestine. Mark Twain's a very prominent American writer, and what he saw in Palestine is very relevant to the debate. He saw barren lands. He didn't see a Palestinian community. He saw empty roads, and he writes extremely vividly. And a scholar is entitled to read a book, as I did of Peter's book, and to find quotes in the book and check them against the original quotes and find them to be accurate, and then do what I did. I don't know whether or not Mr. Finkelstein read footnote 31 that appears on page 246, which says, the research of French cartographer Vital Kuntz are relied on for the conclusions. Oh, I may have mispronounced it. I'm sorry.
No, you misspelled it.
And then I say, see Joan Peters from Time Immemorial, Chicago, etc. And then I say, Peters' conclusions and data have been challenged. And then I quote from Said and Hutchins, I do not in any way rely on them in this book. In other words, what I did, and it's very common for scholars to do that, is I read her books, I read Mr. Finkelstein's criticism of them, and I came away with enough doubt about the conclusions that, although I don't regard the Peters book in any way as a fraud, I think it was a well-intentioned effort to recreate and the very difficult to recreate events that existed in 1890 and 1900. I did find her quotes, which have been, as I said, used extensively by Facts and Myths and other publications, to be quite compelling. And she led me. I mean, I don't purport this book, and none of my writing I don't purport to be an independent historian who goes back to the Middle East and reads original documents. I'm making a case. I'm doing what a lawyer would do, and what lawyers do is they find sources, they check the sources. I had a research staff that obviously checked the sources. I haven't heard a word from Mr. Finkelstein suggesting that the quote from Mark Twain is not an accurate quote. Now, if Peters had made up a quote from Mark Twain, and it hadn't existed, Mark Twain had never written it, and then somebody borrowed the quote without going to check back on whether Mark Twain had said that, obviously that would be a serious charge. I've done nothing like that. The vast majority of my book deals with current situations. In fact, I start my book by saying there has to be a statute of limitations on grievances. I don't try to base the case for Israel on the fact that Jews lived in Palestine before the birth of Jesus, or the fact that Jews were expelled from what is now Israel in 72 AD. And I argue that Palestinians can't really make the case against a two-state solution based on historic claims that go back 100 years. But in the first couple of chapters, which are quite brief, I recount never purporting to be creative or original in the recounting. I recount what has been accepted as the traditional history, and that traditional history includes the fact that the land, particularly what is now what would be Western Palestine, what was the part of Palestine allocated to Israel in the 1947 division, was land that before the Jews got there in the first Aliyah, about 1880 something, and the second Aliyah in the beginning of the 20th century, was land that was coming into disuse. Now, these are controversial.
Which implies
by
it was
the way.
in
There
use
are some
beforehand.
Palestinians who say you shouldn't trust Mark Twain. There's some Palestinians who say you shouldn't trust the various English travelers. Reasonable people could disagree about that. I quote those sources. I lay them out there for people to read so that they can evaluate the claims that Israel was established on the basis of colonialism. I make the following argument, which I'd love to hear Mr. Finkelstein rebut.
Saying Finkelstein.
You can't be a colonialist country unless another country sent people there as soldiers to take over that country. For example, France sent its settlers to Algeria. England sent its settlers to India. Dutch and other countries sent their settlers to parts of Africa with guns to take over. What did the Jews do during the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah? They escaped from countries that were persecuting them. They escaped from Russia. They escaped from Poland. They escaped from Lithuania. They didn't come at the request of those countries. If you claim people were colonialists, you have to say on whose behalf they were working. The Jews who came there weren't working on behalf of Russia. They weren't working on behalf of Poland. They weren't Lithuania. They came as refugees, much like American Jews came as refugees to America. The ones who went to Palestine went with rakes and hoes to try
and
to
guns.
build the land, try to join collectively with the local population. They did, in fact, improve the land. As a result of work projects in Western Palestine, many Arabs from Eastern Palestine moved there. I cite statistics. Peter cites the same statistics, in fact, showing that in various kibbutzim, Rishon LeZion, and others, the fact that 100, I don't remember the exact numbers, Jews moved there attracted 300 or 400. You may disagree with it, but those are the data that I presented, and we can reasonably disagree with that.
Okay.
Now, I just want to make one point about Mr. Finkelstein's research. Well, I don't want to get ad hominem. I don't want to get into this debate, but for example, I do quote Mr. Finkelstein at one point, I think only once in the book, and that is he makes an argument in Edward Said's collection that to judge the 1947 partition, the only fair way to do it is to look at either all of Palestine, which I don't know whether he means to include what became Jordan, Transjordan, or not, or you have to look at what became of Israel after the 1948 war. I disagree with that. What I say respectfully in the book is that when you look at the fairness of the 1947 petition, you only look at the land that was allocated to the state of Israel. And in that land, Jews were clearly a majority according to the UN census. To be sure, once the Arab nations attacked Israel, once the Palestinians attacked Israel, there was a war, and Israel secured more land, which was regularized by a ceasefire in 1949. What Mr. Finkelstein does is he counts that land and says, aha, look at how much they got, and look at the proportion of Jews and Palestinians. That's not the correct demographic to look at. So, we can have reasonable arguments
let's get a
about this,
response
but
to that
let's
from
stay away from the ad hominems and get to the merits of the case.
Professor Dershowitz, I'm not a professor at Harvard, but I do.
You seem to resent that a lot.
But I do teach elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And when we discuss issues like falsifying information, plagiarizing, lifting whole cloth from other books, I've never heard that called ad hominem. For a serious scholar and a serious academic, those are very fundamental issues.
But when they're false, they're ad hominem.
Okay, no, if they're false, then you dispute them.
That's what
But to characterize them as ad hominem seems really out of court for a professor.
No, they are ad hominem. You're attacking. You said I don't deserve to teach at Harvard. That sounds pretty ad hominem to me.
Professor Dershowitz, you raised that issue I'll try to address it, and then we're returning to the substantive issues of your book.
First, tell me why I shouldn't be teaching
I'm going
at
to
Harvard.
refer to that.
Okay.
On page 207 of your book, you say that to deliberately misinform, miseducate, and misdirect
That's
students is a particularly nasty form of educational malpractice.
Of which I accuse
Now,
Noam Chomsky and
I
others,
consider what you have done in the book to be a paradigmatic, a quintessential example of misinforming, miseducating, and misdirecting.
So
you go
write,
on.
write
Allow
an
me
article,
to finish.
Write an article.
Let him
No,
make his
allow
point.
me to finish,
Sure.
Mr. Dershowitz.
Mhm.
I've been very respectful of your time. On page 213, you discuss the Holocaust fraud by Robert Faurisson.
That's
And you write, quote, there was no extensive historical research,
That's
referring to his book.
That's right.
Instead, there was the fraudulent manufacturing of false anti-history.
That's right. And Chomsky wrote, as you know, an introduction to one
Please
of
don't
his
bring
books.
in Mr. Chomsky. He can defend himself. We're
Mhm.
talking about you and your book.
Mhm.
It was the kind of deception, referring to Faurisson's book, now let me quote clearly,
Right.
for which professors are rightly fired.
I stand by
Not
that, of course.
because their views are controversial, and let me underline this again, but because they are violating the most basic canons of historical scholarship.
Well, let me respond to that.
Now,
If
no,
you can compare me to
I don't have-
Faurisson,
I
if
didn't
you
have-
can
I didn't
compare
compare you.
Faurisson made up a
I'm
story
referring
that
to
the
your
Holocaust didn't
standards.
occur.
I'm
Right.
referring to your
But you have to
standard.
understand the
I have no
context.
interest in Faurisson now. I'm talking about your standards.
Absolutely. I
To
stand by those
miseducate,
standards.
misinform, and misdirect, to violate the standards of historical scholarship are grounds for expulsion.
Absolutely.
So it's
And
not an ad hominem argument. It's using your standards.
no, it's an ad hominem argument.
I'm going to
In
interrupt
fact,
here because I
make an
want
ad
to
hominem
get to
argument
some of
about
the.
Faurisson, of
I want to
course.
get to some of the main points
Yeah, let's
of
try
your
to
book.
do that. That would be
Also,
very nice.
we were intrigued on watching Scarborough Country when you debated Sam Husseini, the
Right.
offer that you made.
Right.
We want to just play it for a moment.
Please.
I'll tell you what, I will give $10,000 to the PLO in your name if you can find a historical fact in my book that you can prove to be false. I issue that challenge. I issue it to you. I issue it to the Palestinian Authority. I issue it to Noam Chomsky. I issue it to Edward Said. Every word in my book is accurate, and you can't just simply say it's false without documenting it. Tell me one thing in the book now that is false.
Okay, let's go to the book, The Case for Israel.
Can I just talk about that
$10,000.
for 1 second?
Yes.
And let me tell you what he came up with. This is really fascinating if you show the rest of the clip. He came up, he said on television, I saw a photograph, or I remember, I said a videotape of Israeli soldiers aiming their guns at that, whatever, 12-year-old boy who was caught in the crossfire and killed. And I actually upped the offer to $25,000 if he could produce a photograph or if he could produce proof that he had seen that. Why was I so confident? Because German television did a very thorough study of that one particular incident. Let's just spend 1 minute on that incident. What happened is when that child was killed in his father's arms, the nation of Israel went into almost universal mourning. It was as if they were sitting Shiva on one of their own children.
Bullshit.
A child had died, and it looked as if possibly an Israeli soldier might have shot him. When you contrast that to how Palestinians respond to a child dying in Israel from terrorism, dancing in the streets, it's a very striking comparison. Then German television did a study, and they found out that the Israeli soldiers were positioned in a way that it was physically impossible for the bullet from an Israeli soldier to have hit that Palestinian child, and it was virtually certain that the bullet had come from a Palestinian gun. In my view, that's not particularly relevant. When a child is caught in a crossfire, it's a tragic death resulting from the crossfire. Which bullet actually hit him was not relevant. But that was the answer that he came up with.
Norman Finkelstein.
Well, first of all, I want to clarify the monetary issue. Is it now $25,000?
It's $25,000 on that issue.
Oh, just
on
that
the issue.
In general,
right.
It's $10,000.
And let me be very clear what I said.
We heard it. We just saw it on the tape.
Let me be very clear.
I think it's clear.
I then made it very clear. I said afterward, a material, willful distortion of fact
Professor Dershowitz,
when you
it's
make-
on tape.
when
We
you
just
make-
saw it.
But we're not talking about a spelling mistake.
Oh no, I'm not
we're not
spelling.
talking about a minor
No, I would
mistake and a
far
footnote.
be it for
We're
me to
talking
be
about
so
a
trivial.
serious
All right,
material
let's
willfulness
talk about-
fact that I
Okay,
deliberately
serious-
engaged in.
Serious material
Yes,
facts.
right.
Let's start. Number one, I'm going to first deal with just concrete facts which are not particularly controversial, which can easily be confirmed. On page 80 of your book, you write that according to Benny Morris, between April and June,
Benny Morris being an Israeli
historian, I have a copy of his book here, which
Right.
I'll hold up.
Right.
2,000 to 3,000 Palestinians were made refugees during the second stage of the flight.
Mhm.
Here's the book in front of you.
Yeah.
Page 256. Can you read what the sentence says?
Well, let me read you what I say in my
Mhm.
book. In some areas, Arab commanders.
Please
I'm quoting
don't read
from
the whole
Morris.
paragraph.
No. I'm just reading. In
Mhm.
some, let me put the context. Chomsky says that he says Morris does not believe that any Arab leaders told the Palestinians to leave. And I say, in some areas, I quote from Morris, in some areas, Arab commanders ordered the
I'm not
villages to
disputing that.
evacuate to clear the ground for military purposes to prevent surrender.
Mhm.
More than half a dozen villages, etc., were abandoned during these months as a result of such orders. Elsewhere in East Jerusalem and in many villages around the country, the Arab commanders ordered women, old people, and children to be sent away out of harm's way. Indeed, psychological preparation for the removal of the dependents had begun in 47-48, when the Arab High Command and the Arab League had periodically endorsed such a move and contemplating the future of Palestine. And I say, therefore, Chomsky is simply wrong when he says that there's no evidence. And he says, again, at another point, nobody today believes that any of the refugees were told to leave. And so I dispute that by
Well,
quoting Morris
right.
himself.
You seem to have an obsession with Mr. Chomsky, but he's not here. I'm here. Let's look at the next
Actually,
sentence.
I thought I was going to be debating
Okay,
Chomsky today.
let's look at the
was
next
surprised
sentence.
to
Please, Mr.
have you
Dershowitz,
be here
this
today.
is serious.
I agree with you.
Read the next sentence. Morris estimates, in your book, I have it right in front of me. The
Right.
next sentence.
Morris estimates that between 2,000 and 3,000 Arabs fled their homes during this phase of the Arab-initiated fighting.
Okay, can you please read what Mr. Morris wrote?
Well, no, you're talking
Please
about
read what
one.
Mr. Please read what he wrote.
But if I have the whole book, I will find for
No, you
you,
won't.
if you want to take
Norman
time,
Finkelstein,
that
can you, if
two-
you want the
the 3,000
actually,
people
you
led
would
during
read
this
it.
phase.
Can you
In
read
fact-
the sentence?
Okay, I'm looking at page 256 of
You do
Benny
it,
Morris's
me.
book,
Jesus.
Righteous Victims, A
Right.
History of the Zionist-Arab Conflict.
He's referring
Um,
to phase 2 now, the same one as you.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
And you're talking about right
All
over here.
together. Yeah.
Altogether, about 200,000 to 300,000 Arabs fled their homes during the second stage
Big
of the
difference
Exodus.
between 2 and 3,000 and 2 and 300,000. Now, you could check this many times, Mr. Dershowitz, but you're really going to have to pay the $10,000.
No.
And I hope you allow me I hope you allow me to earmark it for Janine. I would like to give it to Janine.
What the,
Ooh, well, what's 2 decimal places between friends?
Yeah. Right. Wow.
So Jordan, in the part you missed earlier, although I know you've already seen the debate, so you'll remember the part. In the introduction, Finkelstein Dershowitz makes heavy use of a propaganda trope I've heard you refer to many times in conversation, that Israel has the most moral army in the world.
Gotta love that contradiction in terms, yeah.
Yes. He says that Israel is much more moral, for example, than the United States, and it's because it never kills civilians, and you're gone during the point where he said that earlier, but then he repeats that now, that it's like, oh, the one time that that it looked like maybe there was a Palestinian kid who was,
and the whole nation mourned, of course. Yes, we all
yes.
sat Shiva.
Yes. So.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think it's important to point out here, because I think it doesn't totally get clarified between them. There's actually like 2 errors going on here. One is the 2,000 to 3,000 to 2,000 to 300,000, but Dershowitz is also making the claim specifically that number refers to how many Palestinians were told to leave by their Arab commanders, which is like slightly different from what Morris is saying, as far as I understand it.
He also he says that it doesn't help his argument. So why would he make that number up?
He's saying that because he wants us to still think that Morris is saying that Arab commanders told the Palestinians to leave. It's just that in the quote that he cites to back up that claim on that page, that's not actually quite what Morris is saying. He's just saying that many Arabs fled in, I believe, what he calls something like the Arab-initiated fighting. But at least in that sentence, Morris doesn't say 200,000 to 300,000 Arabs were told to leave by Arab commanders. Dershowitz is like conflating two lies. One is the number, and the other is the reason that they left.
Sure, there is truth to the fact that Arab commanders told civilians to leave to get out of harm's way, which is totally reasonable because they were promised both by leadership and by the Israeli side that they would be able to return to their villages. And obviously we know how that played out. There is zero right of return for Palestinians, and that has been something which has been on and off the negotiation table for decades. We're dead in the water now. But absolutely, it's really absurd. And that is exactly the claim that it would help and not hinder, actually, is that this number is significant to how many people would be granted the right of return, because there's a huge difference between 20 to 30,000, between 200 and 300,000. And I'm sure Dershowitz does not count, children of refugees as refugees, is another fantastic trope among Zionists. But something that really strikes me beyond just this whole, Hamas passes out candy in the street and all of Palestinians are celebrating when a child is harmed within Israel from a terror attack, which is absurd and disgusting and racist, is that all Israelis, as if there's anything like Israeli consensus in the first place, such a dumb idea, but that Israelis all mourn when someone is hurt. Just this year alone, Jenin, in the last month, and in January until now, there have been about 140 Palestinians killed in the West Bank. And last month, I think we saw, I want to say 12 or 13 children under the age of 16 murdered by Israeli forces in Jenin in this massive attack that they have been doing in the refugee camp there. You know who's mourning that? No one. They're talking about Israeli democracy. Yeah. No one is mourning that. No one is talking about that. There is no, and in fact, I knew a number of people who certainly would celebrate, because one less Palestinian child is one less future terrorist.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing that's going on throughout all of this. And sometimes it's so obvious that it's like almost silly sounding, is that Dershowitz has all of these double standards. Like the first one was like, the Palestinians need to stop committing acts of terrorism in order for these agreements to be made. But he never says, obviously, the same things about Israel, like that they need to stop terrorizing the Palestinians.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to Alan Dershowitz, he does, in the opening, he said, he backed off from saying that, right? In his opening comments, he said, well, I guess you can't really do that because that would give terrorists a veto, but you have to, you have to like do certain things to crack down on them, whatever, it's like, of course, oddly enough, in the last 20 years, there's never been a point where Alan Dershowitz has said, okay, that's enough. I'm satisfied, know, like, and there never will be, because it's not, it's just not a good faith, claim. I mean, there's, and it's silly. I mean, because there's not, like, if you're going to have, like, just the idea that, the way to, I've been watching, the TV show, The Americans, that's like the protagonists are, all like, are KGB agents. And there's a nice scene where a bunch of Russian diplomats are sitting around a conference table and they're talking about, Russian soldiers being killed in Afghanistan, and like one of them says something that's considered like really out of order, like he did a big faux pas, which is maybe we should get out of Afghanistan if we don't want this to keep happening, right? I mean, like it's like, yeah, I mean, people. If you have soldiers who are occupying towns and enforcing military law and doing things like when there is an attack, like literally like commandeering like random people's apartments, to use as military outposts and kicking them out of their own homes and and doing like, of course there are going to be people who are going to respond violently to that. I mean, the idea that there's a way that like you're going to have like a year of like occupation with absolutely nobody ever like shooting at the occupying soldiers.
Certainly, of course.
I think the research shows that too, that a lot of military intervention instigates terrorist attacks.
100%, and Israeli counter-terrorist experts know that very well.
Yeah.
The other issue, of course, is I think when I was not with you, my Zionist internet dropped on me or something. Is that when he said that Israel responds with one arm behind its back?
Oh no, that's later, I think.
Oh,
yeah.
Excuse me for bringing that up. But the issue of exactly like the issue of what's the word? Proportionality is obviously a huge one, and I hate that is one of the major tropes and defenses of Israel, that not only are they a moral army, but show massive amounts of restraint.
Honestly, I would say even when that concept is used to criticize Israel, I find it frustrating when somebody I like Bernie Sanders will use the phrase like disproportionate force.
Mm-hmm.
And actually Finkelstein points this out, I believe, in his book on Gaza, where he's like, if you shoot a child in the back who's running away, like that's not disproportionate force. Like that's a situation where you don't have the right to use any force.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And there's no way that, again, if you want to play both sides of the field here, that, Israel has one of the most advanced armies militarily, of course, in the world, that they accidentally kill lots of civilians when they're, doing air raids and bombs from above on the most densely populated place in the entire world. And it's just so convenient that Hamas is intermixed with all of the civilians there.
Yeah.
So the same way that, we can question what is the definition of a civilian, non-militant, lots and lots and lots of the deaths this year have been claimed, only half of them were militants, but half of those were children. So it's really absurd and disgusting.
Yeah, and nobody, to your point, Matt, I mean, nobody would say, like, it would just sound absurd rolling off your tongue. Nobody would say that, like, if some militant, Palestinian group, like, blows up a nightclub, nobody would say that they use disproportionate force and
right.
You just say, it's not something you can do, right? That's not. And so to Finkelstein's point that you're quoting, I mean, it's not. I mean, like, even aside from the operational details, I mean, like, if what you're doing is enforcing what on the most charitable reading is a long-term occupation of other people's land, and and I would argue is more, given how closely integrated the West Bank has become in almost every way. Right to the rest of Israel, like I think it may be a more accurate way of saying it would be enforcing an apartheid system, a system of military law on part of the population and civilian law on the other. Like that's just not a legitimate use of violence, right. And so it doesn't even if you were trying to do it in the most careful way possible, which is bullshit, as Jordan says. I mean, it's not. It would still. The disproportionality is really burying the lead, I think, on the main problem with that. But
yeah.
Let's keep watching a bit more of this.
Yeah.
The context isn't this.
We're talking about a variety not
of
the OJ
phases
trial. This is not
You
the
want-
OJ
this is
trial.
not ad
We're not
hominem
going to
either,
play a
right?
game.
Well,
We're
just
not
one.
playing a game now.
We're not
Is your
playing
point
the
that you're citing that what you're saying, Norm Finkelstein, is in Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel? He says 2 to
3,000, and it's 2 to 300,000.
your response to that.
I
Professor
argue that
Dershowitz.
700,000 Arabs.
Don't change the subject,
That's
Mr.
not the subject.
Dershowitz.
Changing the subject.
We're
I
talking
argue
about
that
phase 2, April through June.
700,000 Arabs.
Please don't play this game.
Obviously, the phrase 2 to 3,000 Arabs refers either to a sub-phase or is a type of graphical error.
This is why
If you look
lawyers
the
have
whole-
a bad reputation.
Okay. This is on me because we went like 30 seconds there. But if that was obvious, why did he turn down like 10 invitations to read the sentence from his book? Why didn't he just say, or the sentence from Benny Morris's book? Like, why didn't he just say, well, in that sentence, it says blah, blah, blah. And obviously what I meant was he hadn't come up with that yet.
Sure.
Yeah.
He seems really well prepared for this point, though. From the moment that he starts to change the terms of the monetary offer to now looking constantly at his notes and not at a book, like I don't know.
It's interesting too that he three things go on. He keeps saying, "I have to check the book."
Yes.
That he wrote, and Norm seemingly has like fucking memorized, and then and then he all 1,854 footnotes in the Joan Peters book. He said, but he also then he's saying it's either this sub phase that I've like added to the history,
or I made a typo. It's one or the other.
Typo. Like how could you not know which?
There is no such thing as a
either. I
by the way.
meant to say 2 to 300,000.
Yeah.
Well, I was referring to a sub phase.
Yeah.
He's
Like,
far
what-
more of a lawyer than he is a professor. He
Can
does
we-
not have any grasp on his own numbers. He does not have any grasp on dates. Truly, nor
Can we hear more about
outshines him there.
Like, I really want the debate to pause while we hear about the sub phases.
Oh my God.
The Betty Morris that you're talking about doesn't seem to refer to sub phases. So
Right.
No.
how are you carving up the sub phases? Oh wait.
And we know from Dershowitz's citation, that's how Finkelstein found this sentence, which sentence he was talking about. That they're talking about phase 2. They're both talking about phase 2, and Dershowitz is very clear about that in his book. What was the second point? They're talking about phase 2, and also Morris is in that sentence. He's not necessarily talking about Arab commanders asking Palestinians to leave. So I think he says it's either a typo or I was talking about a sub phase, because he just wants to like sort of leave the impression that Morris was talking about that, and he said this many people.
Then he goes into 700,000, so he can say, well, it's just any little slice of within that number.
Oh,
Right.
I was talking about phase 2A.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, were you? Do you say anything in the book to suggest that? Like,
Metaphase B, which contains subphase 2A. Yeah. No.
Awesome.
Oh my god.
All right.
Because you're playing a
Read
game
the
now.
whole- read-
I've read the book twice. In
But
fact,
do I ever
Dershowitz-
dispute that 700?
Mr.
Do I
Dershowitz,
ever
in
dispute
fact,
that hundreds of
Mr.
thousands
Dershowitz, in
of
fact,
people
I've read
left?
the book 6 times because I read Joan Peters 4 times. So if you add the 4 times to Joan
does she
Peters,
make this point?
with
By the
2
way,
for
does-
you, it's 6 times.
Does she make this point?
No.
Of course she doesn't make
Okay.
this point.
Of course she doesn't, because I'm super original. Now I'm quoting someone else's book, not hers. Thank you.
Also, I think we skipped over a part, like a few seconds, where Norm just keeps saying, "This is why lawyers have such a bad reputation." Says that like a few times.
He is not wrong. Oh my God.
Right, now,
Let's go to the other
let me
book.
get-
I'm going to
no,
interrupt for
I
a
need to
second.
make
I'm going to
this point.
interrupt because stations have to
Okay.
make their point,
But I
which
say
is they have to
700,000.
identify.
So
They have to
obviously-
identify themselves. We'll come back. And if you can stay with us for the show, we will continue this discussion. And our next guest will ask him to wait, and we will do an interview after the program. I think this is too important. We're talking to Alan Dershowitz. His new book is called The Case for Israel. He is debating Norm Finkelstein, his books, The Holocaust Industry, An Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Stay with us.
Jordan Peters
Never gets old.
Yeah, that's true.
You are listening to Democracy Now! That's the late Frank Lowe on saxophone. I'm Amy Goodman, and we're talking with Professor Alan Dershowitz. His new book is called The Case for Israel. Mario Cuomo writes on the back of it, Alan Dershowitz's detailed and penetrating analysis of the issues that fuel the continuing war in Israel should be read by everyone. Norman Finkelstein's book, The Holocaust Industry, has a recommendation on the back by Raoul Hilberg, who is the leading Holocaust historian in this country. And he says, when I read Finkelstein's book at the time of its appearance, I was in the middle of my own investigations. I came to the conclusion he was on the right track. I refer now to the part of the book that deals with the claims against Swiss banks, and I'm jumping ahead. He says, I am by no means the only one who in the coming months or years will totally agree with Finkelstein's breakthrough. Okay.
So let me focus on the 2000 or 3000. This is such an obvious point when you think about it for a second.
With something?
What is the context I'm arguing?
When you think
I'm
about it, like
arguing
I just
that
did during the
lots
break.
and lots of Arabs,
Still hasn't
in
checked the
contradistinction to what Chomsky said, were told to leave by their Arab commanders. Obviously, it's in the interest of that argument to maximize the number who would leave. Only an idiot would deliberately minimize the number who's leave.
Let's refrain from ad hominem attacks.
No. I'm talking about myself.
Okay.
I'm talking about myself now.
Okay.
I would have been an idiot had I used 2,000 when the actual number was 200 to 300. If you wanted to make an accusation, you would say, instead of saying 200 to 300, he said 400,000 to 500,000. Remember the argument. The argument is I'm making is that lots of the Palestinian refugees who left as the result of orders from their leaders during this period of time. So my incentive, if we take Mr. Finkelstein, would be to exaggerate the number. Now he accuses me of reducing the number by 100-fold. Obviously, there are only two possible explanations for that. But why would anyone make a factual error that would hurt their position?
Mr. Dershowitz,
it's the
with all due
stupidest
respect,
allegation.
Mr. Dershowitz,
right?
With all due respect, I cannot understand for the life of me why someone with your reputation and with your accomplishments would cobble together a fraud. That, to me, is the most perplexing question.
Let me ask you a direct question. Let me
just say something. We only have 10 minutes. We want to go to content.
I do, but I want to ask one direct question. Am I right or am I wrong that it would serve the interest of my argument to overstate rather than to understate
Mr. Dershowitz, there is no argument. There are no arguments in your book. Your book is a collection of fraud. Falsification,
let me give you the argument. Well, let me set out the argument. So this is an answer on the merits. Here's the argument.
I don't want to discuss
and we're going to close both mics here. We're closing both microphones, okay? We're going to go through this in a civilized way over the next 10 minutes. You have laid out a challenge, Professor Dershowitz, on Scarborough Country, the program on MSNBC. You said if anyone can find a factual error in the book, we're not talking spelling errors, that you will give $10,000. Sorry.
Yes, as I said, I'm prepared to do that.
Now I'm going to interrupt.
Right.
This is a major challenge. You've put it out on television. Norman Finkelstein, you have laid out one error. Whoever's interested served, who's ever interested served, you did respond.
No.
You said 2,000 to 3,000, quoting citing Benny Morris, the Israeli historian. In fact, he said 200,000 to 300,000 Arabs. Now,
and let me make the point that I do make an argument. Here's the argument I make. I make the argument that the issue is a complex one of the refugees, and that in fact many of the refugees of the 700,000.
But you're citing Benny Morris.
Wait, of course.
And he made a different point than you did.
He made a point that strengthens my argument.
But it's wrong in your book. Whether or not it strengthens, whether or not it serves your argument.
Let me be very clear. If you I do make an argument. My argument is a very serious one. My argument is that many of the Palestinians were told to leave by their commanders. If in fact 200,000 were told to leave instead of 2,000, that strengthens my argument considerably. That is an argument that I make. If the book says 2,000 to 3,000, there are only two explanations. Either it is a typographical error, or I have to check the book, obviously. I was referring to a smaller phase, but it would be ridiculous for anybody.
He doesn't even know what is written in his own book, and he's making these arguments.
Also, like
he's talking about it like you would talk about a book that somebody else wrote that you were already sort of familiar with. Like, well, I assume the author must have meant either this or that. Oh, if only we had the author with us in the room so they can clarify which one they did mean.
There's also a book in front of him. He can look at it if he wants to, but he clearly does not.
They just took a break so that he could look at his own book to figure out what the fuck he was talking about.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I don't know if I can swear on here, but
you absolutely can. You should. In this case.
Fine, but yes. It's, I mean, like, again, you know, like he should know, right? If it's, Alan Dershowitz either meant to refer to a subphase or it was a typographical error. Can we ask him?
Yeah, right. And not only that, like Norm just said, the book was published 3 months before this.
That's so insane.
You know, like,
wow.
No.
That's really interesting.
This is not like the Zero Books editing process. I mean, this is like, you know, there are several, several rounds of back and forth here.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, even with really small, like basically self-publishing, it's like,
even if it's self-published, if he finished writing it 3 months ago, he should really know which one he meant. If he came up with some novel system, like some novel taxonomy of subphases for the war, he shouldn't have just forgotten about it.
Right.
Since then. And he also maybe should refer to it in the book somewhere.
Presumably you remember what you wrote and what you're citing, if you cited it at all. So just unbelievable completely, because I don't believe him. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
He's
No, it's amazing. And it's like, well, this would have, this would strengthen my argument or it wouldn't strengthen my argument. It's like, whatever. I mean, like you wrote it, like it's not true. Like that's I mean, are you at least going to take a beat to be like, yes, that's not true?
Yeah. Also,
and then give $10,000 to the PLO.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. If Reagan is lying whenever his lips move, then I have the same feeling about whenever Dershowitz smiles. It makes me really uncomfortable, first of all, and it feels really out of place. Like, look like a little kid that just got caught doing something wrong.
Like when he was talking about Sam Husseini bringing up the kid, and then he went into this thing about how that was investigated on German television.
Oh my God, he was smiling like a madman.
Yeah, I'm sure whatever German television program he watched did just a crackerjack job.
Sure, certainly not biased towards Israel for reasons. Yeah,
which like, let's really, by the way, take a second on that, right? Because it's like, has any, I mean,
but while he's talking about that, he's smiling.
Are we like, like Germany is, I mean, anybody here has ever like met any Germans? That's like, Germany, the post creation of the state of Israel, like the level of
enabling,
like the level of support, like even German far leftists tend to be like crazily pro-Israel. Very few honorable exceptions. Like that's like the German left is just unlike the left anywhere else except
entirely.
On this topic, right? So it's like, I don't know. I mean, the way he keeps saying the German, it's like, I don't know. I mean, are there any non-German investigations?
Always on time, and they're always correct as it happens. Yeah, no. And then the other authority that he cites is Israeli military. Like, oh yeah, we did our forensics, and a bullet killed the kid. No, can't really figure out where it came from. They've done that recently with I believe it was an Al Jazeera journalist, Shireen Abu Akleh, who
Mhm.
Like they're like, it was an oopsie stray bullet, but it probably wasn't meant,
That's what
to
they always
assassinate
say.
her.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And someone else will come out and be like, oh, we did research and we, consulted with this and that and the other. And like 5 other organizations will say that's actually bullshit. But no,
Yeah.
we'll go with IDF internal investigations instead.
Yeah, not unlike the investigation Dershowitz's own himself was involved in the 1990s that concluded that it was physically impossible that O.J. Simpson's hand could have fit into that glove.
Right, exactly. Same shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is one of the moments I think that creeps me out the most when he smiles is like it's while he's saying that this child was like killed.
What did he say? He also said this like 12-year-old whatever kid died.
Like, it's like a really like sad, horrifying image, and he just has this huge shit-eating grin on his face.
For sure, everyone was mourning about that and making bets on whether or not it was Israel. That makes sense, right?
Yeah,
we're all so sad, and we were all making high-stakes bets on just bring me some footage of this, please. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like a game to him, it really is all just like a game. Like Finkelstein is here because he like cares about like death and destruction. That's what it feels like. And Dershowitz is just like playing around,
100%, and enjoying himself in like sick sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, like the whole thing is ridiculous. I mean, as you said, Jordan, I mean, it's like given the number of children who've died, even like just this year, if the entire nation was sitting shiv every time, like nobody in the country would ever get to look at a mirror, ever. But there's also.
And also, we should note that over 50%, I believe it's over 50% of Gaza's population is children.
Yeah.
So, like,
you can figure out why pretty easily as well.
That's something that, like, we should think about when it comes to like the blockade or anything else. Is like, you were really like terrorizing children here.
Yep.
And it's horrifying. Yeah.
Totally.
All right, let's keep watching.
Purpose would be to overstate.
Okay,
this is the kind of era
let's leave that and go to another point.
What I'm going to do, for the interest of time and trying to be respectful of Professor Dershowitz, is I'll simply quote your statements in the book one after another slowly, and you can simply stop me and say, I can prove that, or I have the evidence.
Sure.
Okay?
Right.
Simple. Page 206, you write, Israel is the only country in the Middle East to have abolished any kind of torture, in fact, as well as in law.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let's start with that one.
Yeah.
The
Except
Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories has a website, and I follow it quite closely.
So do
I went to the website, and I checked under the heading for torture. I'll ask again Amy Goodman, rather than myself, to simply read the first sentence for the latest issue of B'Tselem, and if she wants to continue down.
It's called B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories.
Please keep in mind, Mr. Dershowitz said, in fact, as well as in law. Please.
The first headline, it says torture. Interrogation by torture and absolutely prohibited by Israeli and international law.
Right.
Despite this, Israeli security forces breached the prohibition and torture Palestinians during
I don't agree with that. I mean, we have a reasonable dispute about that. What Israel does, and what Israel did until 1999, was what the United States is now doing in Guantanamo. That is, they put people in uncomfortable shabak positions. They put hoods over their head, often foul-smelling hoods. They play loud music. There's a cover story in the Atlantic Monthly this month, which talks about rough interrogation techniques, and it describes what the United States is doing, and it says that Israel used to do that. Some possibility it continues to do it. That's simply not the kind of torture that international law prohibits. And in fact, my point is, in Jordan, torture is routine. In Egypt, it's routine.
Definitely.
The Israeli Supreme Court took an extraordinarily courageous decision in 1999. I commend everybody to read it. It's online, in which Justice Aaron Barak said that as a democracy, we must fight terrorism with one hand tied behind our back. But in the end, we have the upper hand. because we comply with the rule of law. Israel is to be commended for its attempt to regulate and control the torture of ticking bomb terrorists. I am
So
very
you stand by your statement that they do not
absolutely,
torture.
without
Norman
any
Finkelstein.
question,
Okay.
and that the Supreme Court
Let's be
has
clear.
abolished it. And if anybody were to engage in an act that
I'm not
constituted
debating
torture,
that.
they would be in contempt
Mr.
of court.
Dershowitz.
Yes. And
What
I am
Jordan
right
does,
and you're
what
wrong on
Jordan-
this
6
one.
minutes.
I am
Reasonable
simply
debate.
right.
Right in
Six
wrong.
minutes to go.
Mr.
I mean,
Dershowitz.
have
All right,
you-
let's stop.
Amnesty International, who I know you think is an untrustworthy source, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, they all reach the same conclusion.
And they're wrong.
Israel still continues to practice torture. Well, you can say they're wrong, but let's be clear.
Describe what
All-
Israel does.
Sir,
What
I'm not
do you
going to debate what torture
what do
is.
you define as torture?
I'm not an expert in the topic.
You certainly are not,
no,
but yet
I
you're making an
defer-
accusation.
I don't make the accusation, Mr. Dershowitz. You're confusing things. I go to the mainstream, respected human rights organizations, and I look at what they say.
Let me talk
and
about
they
amnesty.
apply the
Let me-
international
Let me
standards.
I
talk
want
about amnesty.
you
for
have a
1
number of
second.
points here.
Okay,
We have
let's go
5
to
minutes to
I
go.
need to respond
Let's
to
go
this.
to
You did
number
respond.
No, I
two.
didn't respond to this.
Let's
Yeah,
go to
Chloe,
number
That's the
I need
second
to
time
respond
that
to
she
amnesty.
said that. You
Your
did
30 seconds
respond.
to respond.
Okay.
I love
Amnesty
Bestseller.
International.
I was quoting Bestseller.
Amnesty International recently
Wait, can we
said
pause here for
that
just
Aharon Barak should not receive.
I thought it was really skillful, just as like for people who are like interested in debating and stuff. I thought it was really skillful that Finkelstein made sure to bring to everyone's attention that Dershowitz said in fact as well as in law.
Yeah.
I've actually noticed that phrase in like many lawyers / historians, and I think I've seen it in Kissinger's work several times.
Interesting.
It's weird that I often don't really know what is meant by it or like why both are said, but I think
Well, I think the idea is just like it's very easy. Like I'm sure, like I wouldn't be surprised in the least if like in Saddam Hussein's Iraq there were some like statue in the book that said you couldn't torture prisoners.
right.
It just doesn't mean anything, right? You know,
Yeah.
doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And you know, and Dershowitz's point is to claim falsely that that's not the case here. And of course, you know, I mean, I think Norm is trying for the sake of time and for the sake of just like being like not getting bogged down in the weeds and staying on his point to just say, look, here are the most respected human rights organizations. They all say this. This is just a straight, like, you know, I think he has a good instinct to focus on the main point, but also we obviously know goddamn well that there was lots of stuff that in 2003, or for that matter in 2023, that the IDF was doing to prisoners in the West Bank that goes way beyond what
yeah, definitely. I just think it was really skillful that he anticipated that Dershowitz's first counter argument was going to be it's not illegal.
Sure.
You know, because
And if America does it this way, then it must be okay. It's so stupid. No, I think that's a really interesting point. I was also kind of stuck on the that little comment that he made, and I think, you know, it's like in theory and in practice, but what good is a law that isn't enforced? Like that should be understood necessarily. Yeah.
And also, like, you didn't say anything about whether it was legal or not. In fact, you specifically said it's not happening regardless of whether it's legal.
Exactly. Yeah. Sure. They're so good they don't even need a law to put that in place. They just have the moral, you know, principles not to engage in such things. But then he also says that they're making a good effort for it. It's like, you know, it's just really hard not to torture people. It's just like instinct that you have to strain within yourself. Make sure that you give them like pleasantly scented hoods, I guess, or you know, the Abu Ghraib hospitality that we know and love.
Yeah, like he said, like they have to make good faith efforts not to torture people. Like what?
Why?
That never happened to me, dude.
So naturally. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I've never been in that scenario where I'm like, no, don't torture this time, Jordan. You just gotta sit on your hands. Jesus.
Yeah, I'm just constantly going through life making good faith efforts not to torture or kill people.
90% success rate.
Exactly. Nobody ever gives me credit for all the people I and significantly, it's not what he said in the book. Right? He say in the book, Israel's made good faith efforts not to torture people. He said it doesn't torture people.
Exactly, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always some sort of like minor.
Yeah, doesn't even
minor
torture people legally. That's what he said. Yeah.
Exactly. I should say, since we are getting close to the end of part one, that if you are a patron, you should already have a link to the post game where we'll watch part two in your inbox, or if it's not, go to the Patreon. If you're not a patron, patreon.com/Ben Burgis. You get these post games after the main shows on Mondays and Thursdays. You get the Discord server. You get many, many things. Most importantly, our undying love and gratitude for helping to keep this going. But meanwhile, let's watch the last few minutes of part one.
An international prize because he doesn't believe in human rights. He is one of the greatest advocates of human rights. They also, Amnesty also on
Alan
its
Dershowitz,
website.
let me ask you a question. I'm going to interrupt for a second because you're on another point.
Right.
B'Tselem. You just think B'Tselem is wrong.
No, B'Tselem is wrong.
Okay, Norman Finkelstein, next
because
point.
They define torture in a way that would include what the United States is doing.
We have 4 minutes to go.
Impossible. Yeah.
So we're just supposed to take it as a given that nothing that happened in Guantanamo could definitively count as torture.
Right. And again, even if you are somebody who thinks that that is legal under the letter of the law, it's still torture. You know.
If it mattered so deeply, you wouldn't ask what your definition of torture is. Torture is torture. We're not doing it.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it's like, does he seriously think that B'Tselem doesn't think that like anybody gets their fingernails yanked out, in detention cells in the West Bank? Come on.
Sure.
It is also really funny in light of recent events in Israel to go back and watch this, how much emphasis Dershowitz places on the Supreme Court and the check that it plays in human rights abuses.
Yep.
That's the 2023 version of Alan Dershowitz in this debate would be deprived of that argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think
put.
Consistent with the rest of it. I mean, he said somewhere in the beginning, I don't remember if he paused for this, that he thinks a two-state solution is inevitable, and it's just
also
what does that mean? Jeez,
Finkelstein would argue now that it's like maybe almost impossible now.
It's completely untenable, and I can't imagine that Dershowitz would say. It would always come with a caveat, like it's inevitable, except if we don't have proper Palestinian leadership, in which case,
or if the Palestinians stop using terrorism or whatever.
I mean, we're on 20 years straight since he said that, in which it's continued to be evident, right? That's not. It sure doesn't seem inevitable, and yes, I'm completely with you, Maddie. I wrote an article for Jacobin in 2020. I think it was like late summer 2020. I remember having a huge argument with David Feldman about it on his show. What's that?
A real argument?
A real one, not like I wasn't having an argument with one of David's characters. I was having an argument with David. Called Israel Doesn't Have a Right to Exist, but Israelis and Palestinians do. That like made a lot of the basic points about the absurdity of the idea of doing a two-state solution at this point, because we are, at that point, 2020. So that was 53 years into the process of integration of this territory into Israel, which it is for really practically every purpose except for giving citizenship to Palestinians who live there. If you are a Jewish settler and you live in any of these same towns, the West Bank, if you commit a crime, you're prosecuted under Israeli civilian law. You can vote in Israeli elections.
You're protected by the IDF outside of the Green Line as well.
Yeah, you're protected by the IDF. You have really, like to put a really fine point on it, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody, like anybody who's watching who qualifies under the law of return wanted to immigrate to Israel tomorrow, you wouldn't have to you wouldn't have to spend a year first establishing your residency on within quote unquote Israel proper, right? You could just go straight to a West Bank settlement and live there, because for every legal purpose, living there is considered to be living in Israel. There's that's like for every legal purpose except giving the Palestinians.
Well, it's not just for the sake of individuals; it's for the end goal of further annexation of the West Bank. Of course, I think the last count, we're at more than 500,000. No, what am I talking about? Yeah, I think it's almost 750,000 settlers within the West Bank and the Golan Heights currently, which is a huge expansion from even the last 5 years.
Yeah, which is also the part of the absurdity of this, and don't get me wrong, one state solution is also, if anything, maybe right now, given current realities, even harder to imagine, but just logistically, at this point, a two-state solution would mean that, it's kind of funny in a way that that's the sort of moderate, reasonable view that that you're not considered a possible anti-Semite if you say is the one that in order to implement in any meaningful way, you'd have to. So it wasn't just a two-state solution for a bunch of disconnected cantons in the West Bank, plus Gaza obviously totally disconnected from the whole thing.
Yeah, incontiguous. How exciting.
Yeah, exactly right. If it wasn't just that, to implement it in any meaningful way, to do the reasonable, moderate one, you'd have to deport several 100,000 people from this territory, right? Like that, which is actually, on the face of it, much more extreme than just saying, hey, you've got this de facto state that's existed for the longest time, that's been completely integrated for the longest time. Just give everybody their equal rights. And, I promise you the sky would not fall if that happened. There would, there would be there would be more Arab parties. You'd have to, you'd have to be, to include in coalitions and stuff. And, but there was this sort of idea that this would be this apocalyptic scenario that, that would somehow lead to a state of affairs where what would at that point only be the Jewish 47% or whatever of the population would be completely disempowered.
No, that's exactly the issue, is that even in the most idealistically democratic scenario, Jews would still be obsessed with race and demographics.
Yeah.
They would still want to maintain power somehow.
Yeah, and again, if we're talking about ethnic voting blocks, if it is 47% or whatever, that's quite a voting block. That's I think this idea that it's that would suddenly mean that Israeli Jews have absolutely no power in this state,
sure,
and are subject to possible genocide. All this stuff is, all this stuff is ridiculous. But
currently Israel, parties with Arab parties that want to form within Israel have to confirm to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which is to ask them to agree to nonsense, eventually as well. And the ones who manage to do that aren't well loved by the people that they're meant to represent. So,
right. All right, let's keep going.
Number two, you write on page 126. There is no evidence that Israeli soldiers deliberately killed even a single civilian in Jenin.
Absolutely.
Now, Mr. Dershowitz, I looked carefully at your book. You don't like Amnesty International.
I'm a member.
You don't like.
I'm a member.
I know,
of
but on the question of Israel, on the question of Israel,
I like Amnesty on Israel in a great many instances, but I disagree with some of its conclusions.
And you don't particularly like B'Tselem.
I do like B'Tselem. If I were an Israeli, I'd belong to B'Tselem. So don't characterize my views. You don't know my views.
I read your book, or the book you purport to have written.
Now you're claiming somebody else wrote it.
I hope so. For your sake, I truly hope you did not write that book.
I proudly wrote it.
I think the honorable thing for you to do would be to say, I didn't write the book. I had no time to read it. I'm sorry.
I wrote every word.
That would be the honorable thing.
I have
okay, you've made the point about Jenin and whether an Israeli soldier, whether
deliberately
shot a civilian.
Let's quote Human Rights Watch.
Yes.
They put out an extensive report on Jenin. Now, Human Rights Watch, you nowhere in your book mention Nowhere. Let's see what Human Rights Watch concluded on Jenin. Quote, there's prima facie evidence that Israel committed, quote, war crimes in Jenin. Further, quote, and I want everyone to listen carefully, many of the civilian killings documented by Human Rights Watch amounted to unlawful or willful killings by the IDF. Please listen to the words.
I'm listening to the words, killings. And I deal with this very directly in my book.
And then Human Rights Watch copiously documents multiple cases of willful killings by Israel. Okay. What did Mr. Dershowitz write?
What did Mr. Dershowitz write?
There is not a single case of you want to
not
know,
only not
Mr.
a single case of Jenin, but let me tell you why I make my point. I make my point because there is absolutely no incentive for the United States or for Israel or for any other democracy ever willfully to kill an innocent civilian. Every time an innocent civilian is killed, it hurts Israel. It hurts it domestically. It hurts it. No. Let me finish my point. It hurts it internationally. Now, every
this is like anthropomorphic Jewish mother that he makes Israel into every time. Like, oh my heart, I can't believe we. Oh no, not one of the children. God forbid.
Yeah. Also, I have no incentive to smoke cigarettes, but that doesn't make it right.
I do, and I'm looking forward to one.
Sure, yeah. God, yeah. No, I mean, like, look, do you seriously think that this is like whiskey in this glass right now? I mean, like, do you know what every glass of that does to my liver? Come on, I wouldn't do that. The apple juice. It's also. I was also wondering during his like this important part of his biography where he was bravely opposed to the war in Vietnam in his head. Did that opposition have something to do with the idea that the United States was killing innocent people in Vietnam? Like, why would this argument apply there?
I doubt it. I think that he probably was opposed to it for like strategic reasons, not for like.
I guess assuming for the sake of argument that he was actually opposed in any way, shape, or form to the
right.
He's clearly demonstrating that he's a huge humanitarian here. He doesn't even believe in the concept of hurting other people. It can't happen. Just doesn't ever happen.
Also, why does this incentive only apply to Israel? I mean, doesn't like Hamas lose reputation around the world every time it kills a civilian? No,
so that's the huge double standard. Of course, it's always with the implication that the other side is not holding itself to such principles.
The double standards are relentless. In part 2, I shit you not, he will claim that Newton's law of physics. He basically argues that Newton's law of physics applies to the Palestinians and not the Israelis, because he argues that the Palestinians, we should count Israeli civilian deaths when Palestinians shoot guns into the air. But Finkelstein later says that you should do the same thing with Israelis.
That's fucking insane. I haven't not watched the second part, so I'm.
And then he's like, well, people fire for lots of reasons. They fire warning shots, like they,
gender reveal parties. Oh wait, that's America.
When it's applied to Israel, he's like, well, the military shoots up in the air and all over the place for lots of reasons. You can't count every bullet, but if it's Palestinians firing guns off in the air, he specifically mentions Newton's law of physics, and then makes an argument right after that you should not apply that to Israel.
He's not wrong. Israeli soldiers fire warning shots into knees, not the air.
Yeah. But Finkelstein is like, by that logic, if you use 1 million bullets on Palestine, that's, by your logic, that's 1 million casualties.
Yeah.
It's insane. Wow.
All right.
Yeah. This is going to be difficult to get through.
In urban guerrilla warfare will inadvertently kill civilians. But the very idea that an Israeli soldier who are trained in the idea of the holiness of arms, who get better training about avoiding civilians, who are punished for killing
Let
civilians.
Norman Finkelstein
Okay.
read a response. You're making the point that in
incentive.
general you wouldn't think they
no
would.
Dershowitz gave a
incentive to
very
kill a
lovely
civilian.
bar mitzvah
Right.
speech. Now let's read
Now,
what
that's a little ad hominem, too,
let's
I
see
would
what
think.
the
Maybe
Human
even a
Rights
little
Watch
racist.
wrote. Quote, among the
You can hear her
civilian
laughing at
deaths
that one.
were those of Kamel Zigir. Listen carefully. A 57-year-old wheelchair-bound man who was shot and run over by a tank on a major road outside the camp on April 10, even though he had a white flag attached to his wheelchair. That sounds pretty deliberate to me,
If
Mr.
it's
Hirsch.
true,
If it's
and
true,
the Israeli
the whole
authorities
world
have
is
done-
lying. Only
No,
Joan
no.
Peters tells the
Wait,
truth.
wait. First of all, Joan Peters has never written about this issue. This issue is one where, of course, not only the Israeli military, but the United States has investigated Jenin. The United Nations has investigated Jenin. Some of the
Did they make up that example?
Some of the
Let's
same
get
sources.
this clear.
Some of the
Did
same
Human
sources
Rights Watch
that
make
you're
up that
citing
example?
first said there
Did
were
Human Rights Watch
5,000
make up that
people
example?
killed. No, that was an
Did
example.
Human Rights you said
they were given it to
please,
them
Mr.
by a
Dershowitz,
source,
this is
and
disgraceful.
it was disputed.
You're shaming your institution.
I'm not, except first
You're
of all,
shaming your institution.
let me make it very clear. I
You
don't speak
said-
on
you
behalf
said
of Harvard.
not
I speak
a
on behalf,
single-
not a single one.
Did Human Rights
Absolutely.
Watch make that up?
No, but
Did Human Rights Watch make it up?
Human Rights Watch
Did
attributes
it make it up?
Let me,
No.
can
Did
I
they make
finish
up
my-
that
can I
example?
finish my point?
All right, on that note,
What
we're wrapping up
happens
the
what
program.
happens is Human Rights quotes people who
Did you, Professor
who make
Dershowitz,
it
let
up,
me
of
ask this
course,
question.
yes.
Did you investigate the Human Rights Watch
Of
report?
course I did, and I read it.
And you found that to
and
be
I
incredible.
found that to be incorrect. Not only that, the United States government has found that to be incorrect. And
On
not
that
only
note, we have to wrap up the show. I want to thank you both for
just-
being with us. Alan Dershowitz, The Case for Israel, Norman Finkelstein, The Holocaust Industry. You decide. Our website, www.democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining.
I love that.
Ooh.
I love
So
that
we-
little hesitation before she says, "You decide."
You decide. You know what? Fuck it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, that okay. So yeah, there is a part 2. So we're gonna go to the post game for patrons in a minute. Watch part 2. I guess maybe my last thought before I go to you guys for the main show is, earlier Norm at the beginning said something that was funny. That was like, yeah, maybe Reed is pretty anti-Semitic if anybody but the most Jewish man alive had said it about Dershowitz being like a Talmudist / shyster and I was just thinking though during that whole thing about torture that that's his argument. Actually, there is a very Talmudic ring to it. There's a point in the Talmud where there's like a specific carve out for saying that saying at a wedding that the bride is beautiful, that like no matter what she looks like, that's okay because all brides are legally beautiful. And there's
you can't see their face anyway, so it's a good guess.
and that whole thing about how nothing that's going on at Guantanamo Bay could possibly be torture, that there's that like, well, if this is what the U.S. does, I mean, that's not torture. That's like that does very much have the ring to it of all brides are legally beautiful. That it's like everything that the United States does is legally not, is like definitionally not torture, which is impressive because we know that the U.S. military isn't even the most moral army in the world. At best, it could be number 2.
Indeed. Well, Israel is a shining example. The Ola Goyim, light unto the nations. So that's written in some place in the Bible. So Dershowitz probably thinks that it's legally fact as well. God damn.
Yeah. I had a couple quick things. One is that I think that there's a lot of crosstalk and it's really easy to miss. I didn't even notice this until like after watching the debate 3 or 4 times. At some point when they're like yelling at each other, Dershowitz says to Finkelstein, or he starts to say to Finkelstein, "I have handwritten first drafts." When Finkelstein starts accusing him of not having written the book, Dershowitz slips in a comment where he says, "I have handwritten first drafts I can show you." He says it really fast, and they're both talking, so it's really hard to catch. And I actually asked Norm, like, did you ever ask him to like produce those? Because I'm suspicious of that, and I don't know, it's a weird thing to say, but anyway, Norm's answer was like, of course I asked him for the handwritten first draft, and like, of course he didn't produce it. It's not surprising, but I did think it was important to note because, it's easy to miss.
I heard that Norm got his hands on some sort of copy draft early on, where he found like literally the substantiation of plagiarism, where he was telling the researchers like, go to X page of the what I want to say Joan Rivers so bad. Sorry. I would love to hear her take on all of this too, of course. He really did the thing that he was accused of and denied so heavily. But
I also really like you investigated what the Human Rights Watch example. Of course I did. It's like, really? So because like we just heard a minute ago that Human Rights Watch isn't even mentioned in your book where you're making this claim, right? So it's like, it's weird that you went through all that work to like look at what Human Rights Watch had said that contradicts what you said in the book, and you found some sort of independent evidence that you were wrong, that they were wrong, and then you didn't think to throw it in a footnote or something.
Of course you would join B'Tselem if you were in Israel. I think they're wrong, but I would totally join the organization given the opportunity.
He just likes to join things.
So I did find, when I asked Norm, he said, of course I asked him for the handwritten version, and of course he didn't send it.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. Let's go to the post game. Which, yes, hilariously, the post in the Patreon says I was guessing maybe by 10:30 we East Coast time we'd be in the post game. We have sailed right past that, but we do want to go. We do want to go now because we do want to check out part 2. So I will see people on the other side. Left is best.